Imagine living a life unaffected by the chaos of the world, resistant to the urban flow of fortune, and strong enough to withstand the difficulties that life will surely bring your way. It sounds like an impossible dream, doesn't it? Would you believe me if I told you that the key to that kind of life has been around for thousands of years, just waiting for you to find it? Welcome to a very special video, a complete guide to the world of Stoicism. We are frequently carried away by the waves of emotions, distractions, and worldly desires. In our chaotic modern lives, which are often accompanied by noise and hurry, Stoicism offers a way to find inner peace, self-control, and mental toughness. It is firm and immovable like a rock. Mastering the art of letting go is the first thing. And here's the truth: life doesn't get easier, but you can get stronger. Stoicism doesn't teach you how to escape difficulty. It teaches you how to face it with a calm mind and a steady hand. It doesn't numb you to life. It sharpens your senses to what truly matters. And in a world addicted to reaction, noise, and ego, Stoicism becomes your anchor. It's not about becoming cold. It's about becoming unshakable. So if you've ever felt overwhelmed, reactive, or just tired of chasing things that don't bring lasting peace, you're not alone, and you're in the right place. We're going deep in this video, not just with theory, but with practical, powerful Stoic wisdom that can reshape how you live, think, and face the world. If what we're building here resonates with you, if it helps you pause, reflect, and move through life with a little more clarity, consider subscribing. It's a simple act, but it helps us reach others walking a similar path. More than that, it affirms that you're choosing to grow with purpose. What if the real battle isn't out there, but inside you? Before we fix the world, we must understand the war within our own minds. It's tempting to point fingers outward, to blame society, politics, other people, but that's often just a distraction. The chaos we see outside reflects something deeper, something brewing in the quiet, conflicted spaces within us. We carry it in our thoughts, our moods, our restless scrolling and sleepless nights. And yet, most of us never stop long enough to look inward. We move fast, hoping momentum will drown the noise. But it doesn't. It just buries it. Carl Jung once said, "Your visions will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes." That's not just poetic, it's practical, because the struggles we face, procrastination, envy, anger, insecurity, they aren't random. They rise from patterns that live within us, shaped over time by experience, trauma, and belief. And if we don't bring them into the light, they will quietly control us, not by force, but by familiarity. They will guide our choices, limit our risks, and keep us living the same year over and over, calling it a life. Most people don't want to hear that. It's much easier to believe the problem is someone else, that if we could just get the promotion, find the perfect partner, or silence that one critic, we'd finally be at peace. But peace isn't passive. It doesn't show up like a delivery. It's something we build piece by piece through understanding, through honesty. And that journey always begins where it hurts the most, inside. Think of how often we carry inner conflict. You say you want to be confident, yet you shrink every time you're seen. You want connection, but you push people away the moment they get close. You crave purpose, but spend hours avoiding your own thoughts. Why? Because the mind is not a unified force, it's a battleground. Plato once compared the soul to a chariot pulled by two horses, one noble, one wild. One pulls toward reason and virtue, the other toward impulse and chaos. And the charioteer, that's you, trying to steer both. Most of the time, we're not even holding the reins. The noble horse whispers of discipline, integrity, and long-term growth. The wild one demands comfort, distraction, and immediate relief. And both are part of you. The war isn't about destroying one side, it's about learning how to guide them both. That's the inner work, the deep work, not fixing yourself like a broken machine, but understanding yourself like a layered story. And every story needs truth, hard truth, like the realization that much of what we chase is not truly ours. It's inherited, absorbed, conditioned. We're told who to be before we ever get a chance to ask who we are. So we play roles: good student, responsible adult, team player, and somewhere along the way, we lose track of the real self underneath. Not the curated version, not the image, the messy, curious, hurting, hopeful person behind the mask. Aristotle believed that knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. But how do we do that when our attention is constantly pulled outward? When silence feels like pressure and restlessness is normal? We've created a world where stimulation is endless, but reflection is rare. And that has a cost. We become strangers to ourselves. We recognize our selfies, but not our shadows. And yet, those shadows matter, because they're not evil, they're wounded. Carl Jung called it the shadow, the parts of ourselves we reject, suppress, or deny. Not because they're bad, but because we fear them. The anger we bury, the jealousy we hide, the sadness we never voice. It all gets stored in the shadow. And until we confront it, it controls us from the dark, not overtly, but subtly, in our reactions, in our triggers, in the stories we tell about other people, stories that are often mirrors of our own fears. To understand this war is to realize that self-awareness is not a luxury. It's a responsibility, because when you don't know your own mind, you are at the mercy of it. It will convince you of things that aren't true. It will replay old pain as if it's happening now. It will project your wounds onto others and call it justice. And worst of all, it will keep you busy, very busy, doing things that feel urgent, but leave you empty. Socrates once said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Harsh words, maybe. But what he meant wasn't that you had to become a philosopher. He meant that life without reflection becomes repetition, and repetition without understanding leads to regret. You wake up years later wondering how you got here, why you're tired all the time, why nothing satisfies you for long. That's the danger of ignoring the inner war. It doesn't just affect your mood, it shapes your entire direction. When you don't face your fears, you organize your life around them. You say no to opportunities not because they're wrong, but because they make you feel exposed. You stay in familiar pain because it's less frightening than unfamiliar freedom. And all the while, you tell yourself you're being careful, logical, realistic. But really you're just scared. And that's okay. Fear is part of being human. But so is courage. And courage isn't loud, it's quiet. It's the moment you finally sit with your thoughts instead of running. The decision to ask yourself, why do I really feel this way? Instead of numbing it with a screen. It's the daily effort to choose presence over distraction, honesty over comfort, growth over ego. We live in a time where self-help is everywhere, and yet true self-understanding is rare. There's a difference between consuming wisdom and living it, between knowing the right quotes and practicing the hard habits. Because insight without integration is just noise. You can read every book, follow every guru, and still be at war within. What changes you isn't information, it's attention. Focused, patient attention to your own inner life. And in that attention, you begin to see patterns. You notice how your tone changes when you feel threatened, how you dismiss compliments, how you replay that one mistake from 5 years ago like it happened yesterday. You start to connect the dots between your present behavior and your past wounds. And that's when something powerful happens. compassion. Not the fluffy kind, but real, grounded compassion for yourself. Not because everything you've done was right, but because everything you've done came from somewhere. From fear, from love, from confusion, from trying your best with the tools you had at the time. And when you begin to understand yourself that way, the war softens, the judgment quiets, and you stop needing to fight so much. That's the paradox. The more you accept yourself, the more you grow. Because growth doesn't come from shame. It comes from awareness, from seeing clearly, not condemning blindly. And that clarity gives you choice. You can respond instead of react. You can pause instead of spiral. You can choose your values over your impulses, not because someone told you to, but because you know who you are and what you stand for. And that's where real power lives. Not in control over others, not in domination, but in sovereignty, the ability to govern your own mind, to be the charioteer, not the dragged rider, to recognize when your old patterns are rising and still choose differently. That's freedom. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of awareness within it. It's easy to forget that we are layered beings, that we carry different voices inside, some old, some new, some loud, some silent, and they don't always agree. That's okay. Harmony doesn't mean uniformity. It means learning how to listen, how to guide the inner choir instead of silencing it, because each part of you has something to say, even the angry part, even the sad part, especially the wounded part. They're not your enemies, they're your signals, signals that you've been through something, that you've cared deeply, that you've longed for more. And when you finally give them a seat at the table, not to control, but to be heard, you stop being a stranger to yourself. You become a home, not a perfect one, but a true one. And from that place, something shifts. You stop needing to fix the world to feel okay, because you've learned how to make peace within. That doesn't mean you stop caring about injustice or change, but it means your actions come from clarity, not reactivity, from alignment, not compensation. You're no longer trying to save others just to avoid saving yourself. The world will always have its battles, but the most important one, the one that shapes how you show up in every relationship, every choice, every moment, is the one within. Win that, and everything else begins to align. Not instantly, not perfectly, but meaningfully. So the next time you feel restless, angry, numb, or lost, pause, not to escape, but to look inward, not to solve yourself, but to understand yourself, because maybe the real battle was never out there. Maybe it was always here, quiet, constant, and waiting for your attention. How much of your anxiety comes from trying to control the uncontrollable? That quiet tension in your chest, that endless spinning of thoughts at night. How much of it is caused by your mind grasping at things it was never meant to hold? We check our phones obsessively, refresh our inboxes, worry about what others think, plan for a future we can't predict, and replay the past like we could somehow rewrite it. All in the name of control. All in the hope that if we can just hold all the strings tightly enough, nothing will fall apart. But things still fall apart. The truth is, life doesn't wait for you to be ready. It moves unpredictably, messily, sometimes cruelly, and often without your permission. And somewhere along the way, we started believing that if we could just be smarter, faster, better prepared, we'd finally get ahead of it. We'd finally outmaneuver the chaos. But that chase is exhausting. It wears you down slowly, convincing you that you're failing, not because you are, but because you've taken on a task no one can complete. Socrates said, "He is richest who is content with the least, for content is the wealth of nature." What if that contentment begins not with more effort, but with less resistance? with understanding what is yours to hold and what isn't. The weather, the economy, someone else's opinion of you, the outcome of every risk you take. These are not your domain, and yet we try to micromanage them like fragile machines. When they slip from our grasp, we feel like we've failed. But it's not failure. It's friction between what we wish we controlled and what we actually do. There's a kind of peace that comes with accepting limits, not the passive kind that gives up, but the strong, grounded kind that knows the difference between power and pressure, between what you're responsible for and what you're simply experiencing. Responsibility, real responsibility, doesn't mean controlling outcomes. It means owning your response, your attitude, your effort, your integrity. Everything else is weather. Carl Jung once said, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." That choice, that tiny space between stimulus and response, is where your true power lives, not in forcing life to bend to your will, but in shaping how you move through it, not in obsessing over things beyond you, but in mastering what begins within you. Think of how much weight you carry that doesn't belong to you. Other people's moods, their decisions, their words. You replay conversations, try to read between the lines, imagine what you could have said differently, but those moments are gone. You can't re-enter them, you can't revise them, and still your mind clings to them like they might offer something new. They won't. What they offer is a lesson, not a leash. Learn it and let it go. Because control isn't always about domination. Sometimes control is learning how to release, letting go of the illusion that if you just think hard enough or try long enough, you can guarantee a perfect outcome. Life doesn't deal in guarantees. It deals in seasons, in cycles, in mystery. Plato once compared the human soul to a city, and like any city, there are areas we manage, and those we don't. But when we confuse the boundaries, when we try to patrol streets that don't belong to us, chaos spreads. We become overextended, distracted, disoriented, and then we wonder why we feel anxious, why we can't sleep, why nothing feels enough. Because when you're stretched too thin between what you can do and what you wish you could control, you lose the present moment. And that's the only place anything actually happens. The past is a memory. The future is an idea. But your breath, your actions, your words, those live here. Now, Aristotle taught that knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. But knowing yourself also means knowing your limits. It means being honest about what is yours to carry and what never was. Not everything that crosses your mind deserves your energy. Not every discomfort needs a solution. Some things just need to be observed, felt, allowed to pass like a storm over the sea. It's tempting to think that peace comes when everything outside is calm, when the schedule clears, when the job is secure, when people finally understand you. But peace isn't something you wait for. It's something you create through clarity. Clarity about what you're here to do and what you must let be. That's the line. Where your power ends, your peace begins. But how do we find that line when we've been taught to fix everything? From a young age, we're rewarded for taking charge, for solving problems, for doing more. So we grow into adults who think that effort equals control. That if something's wrong, it must mean we're not trying hard enough, and so we try harder, push more, take on burdens that aren't even ours. We internalize the belief that discomfort means something is broken, that worry is a kind of moral compass, but sometimes worry is just noise, a reaction, not a signal. And not everything needs to be fixed. Some things just need to be faced, with presence, with patience, without panic. The philosopher Epictetus, a Stoic, believed that some things are up to us and some things are not. This simple idea holds immense power. It reminds us that wisdom doesn't always mean knowing what to do. Sometimes it means knowing when to stop, when to breathe, when to surrender, not in weakness, but in wisdom. Because surrender isn't giving up. It's choosing not to waste your energy on what you cannot change. It's turning your gaze inward, toward the only space where real change is possible. Your thoughts, your habits, your character. That's where your work begins. And it's enough. Letting go doesn't mean detachment from life. It means deeper engagement with what actually matters. When you stop trying to control everything, you can finally focus on what you can influence. Your tone in that conversation, the way you show up for someone you love, the discipline you bring to your goals. These are real, they are yours, and they matter. The more you live from that place, the more you start to notice the noise fade. You feel less pulled by urgency and more rooted in clarity. You stop chasing perfection and start practicing presence. You begin to see how much of your anxiety was a byproduct of misdirected energy. It wasn't that life was too much. It was that you were holding too tightly to things you were never meant to control. And with that space comes peace. Not because life gets easier, but because you stop fighting battles that aren't yours. You stop answering questions that don't need answers. You start living more fully in your own lane. And with each choice, you build a quiet confidence. Not the kind that needs to prove itself, but the kind that simply knows. You know where you begin and where the world ends. You know which burdens to hold and which to release. You know that peace isn't passive, it's a practice. One that begins every single time with awareness. With asking yourself, is this mine to carry? Because not every emotion belongs to you, not every expectation is your job to meet, and not every fear is your responsibility to resolve. Some are inherited, some are projected, some are simply echoes from a past that no longer fits your present. The work is not to control all of them, it's to see them, to choose which ones you let in. Carl Jung believed that, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. That's what this is about. Not rewriting fate, but reclaiming authorship. Not being blown by the winds of life, but becoming the anchor in the storm. And storms will come, but you'll face them differently. Not by holding tighter, but by standing taller. Not by trying to predict every wave, but by trusting your ability to navigate. Not with fear, but with presence. A presence built on boundaries, on understanding what's yours and what's not. That's when peace becomes possible. Not as an escape, but as a foundation. You stop needing everything to go your way. You stop fearing discomfort. You realize you can handle more than you thought, not because you control everything, but because you're finally focusing on what you can control. Your character, your choices, your clarity. And from that place, your life begins to shift. You make decisions from alignment, not anxiety. You connect from authenticity, not obligation. You show up from wholeness, not from fear of missing something. And slowly the noise fades. The inner battles quiet. The tension eases. Not because the world changed, but because you did. You understood where your power ends and where your responsibility begins. You stopped gripping what you couldn't hold, and you discovered that the peace you were chasing was never out there. It was always within, waiting for you to let go, waiting for you to come home. Imagine your mind as a stronghold, a place that should protect you, shelter you, give you clarity when the world outside becomes too loud. But what happens when that stronghold has no walls? Or worse, when the walls are crumbling? When thoughts rush in without filter, emotions storm the gates, and fear settles in the throne room. What does it really take to build those mental walls? Ones that don't isolate, but filter. That don't shut life out, but allow you to choose what stays. It starts with attention, not the scattered, overstimulated kind that jumps from screen to screen, but deep, deliberate attention, the kind that listens. Because everything that enters your mind starts with what you give your attention to. Every headline, every conversation, every whispered fear or hope, you let them in. Most of the time, not consciously. And over time, they shape the architecture of your inner world. What you believe, what you fear, what you crave, they all come from what you've let through the gates. Carl Jung once said, "You are what you do, not what you say you'll do." The same applies to your mind. You are what you consistently allow in, not what you claim to believe. If your thoughts are constantly anxious, if your focus is always fractured, if your inner voice is full of criticism, it's worth asking, who built these walls? And are they still serving you? Because walls aren't always protective. Sometimes they're built from fear, shaped by old wounds. Sometimes they keep out not just chaos, but connection. So building a stronghold doesn't mean becoming rigid or closed off. It means becoming discerning, wise. It means choosing what gets your energy and what doesn't. Plato believed that the first and greatest victory is to conquer yourself. Not in the aggressive, forceful way we often think of conquest, but in the quiet, enduring way that requires patience and self-honesty, the ability to pause before reacting, to sit with discomfort instead of running, to say no to what tempts and yes to what strengthens, even when it's the harder choice. Those are the mental bricks we build with: clarity, discipline, humility. And each time we make a choice aligned with them, the walls grow stronger. Not taller, not thicker, but more intelligent, more refined. Because this isn't about shutting life out. It's about creating boundaries that allow you to stay grounded within life, to face storms without being swept away by them. But most of us never learn this. We're taught how to solve problems, not how to filter input. We're rewarded for speed, not for thoughtfulness. And in that rush, the mind becomes a marketplace, loud, crowded, messy, everyone shouting for your attention. And you try to listen to all of them. No wonder you feel overwhelmed. Socrates once said, "Beware the barrenness of a busy life." He understood something we still struggle with. Noise isn't progress. Movement isn't growth. You can be busy from morning till night and still be lost, especially if your mind is open to everything, but anchored to nothing. That's not a stronghold, it's a revolving door. So how do we begin to change that? We start with what we consume. Not just food or media, but thoughts, beliefs, conversations. Because every word you hear, every image you scroll past, every story you repeat, it leaves an imprint. Some reinforce fear, others feed insecurity. A few may strengthen you, but unless you're paying attention, they all blend together into one anxious blur, and that blur becomes your reality. This is where the practice of mental boundaries comes in. Asking yourself, does this deserve a place in my mind? Not out of judgment, but out of protection. Not everything has to be processed. Not every opinion matters. Not every crisis needs your emotional energy. That's not apathy. It's strategy. It's knowing that your inner space is limited, and you want it filled with things that align with truth, not noise. Aristotle said, "We are what we repeatedly do." Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. The same goes for your mental landscape. You don't build a stronghold in a day. You build it with small, repeated acts. Choosing a walk instead of a doom scroll. Breathing instead of reacting. Reflecting instead of judging. These aren't just healthy habits. They're architecture. They build walls that don't shut life out, but give your thoughts structure, give your emotions context. You begin to notice which thoughts are just passing weather, and which ones hold truth. You see fear for what it is, loud, urgent, but not always accurate. You start responding instead of reacting, not because you've shut down your emotions, but because you've given them space, because your stronghold doesn't panic at the first sign of trouble. It evaluates, it decides, it knows. And knowing yourself, really knowing yourself, is the cornerstone of all of it. Jung believed that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Think about that. Every belief you haven't questioned, every reaction you've never examined, every story you've told yourself since childhood, they are the architects of your inner world. And unless you take time to meet them, they will shape your future without your awareness. So this isn't just about building walls, it's about illuminating rooms, exploring the parts of yourself you've ignored, the ones that hide behind sarcasm, distraction, or perfectionism. Because they're not trying to ruin you, they're trying to protect you in their own confused way. But when you finally look at them, really look, you can choose better guards for your gates. Not fear, not ego, but wisdom, truth, clarity. Clarity doesn't mean certainty, it means knowing what matters, even when the future is unknown. It means filtering out the unnecessary so you can focus on the essential. It means recognizing that your mind is not a dumping ground, it's sacred ground, and what you allow in shapes who you become. Let's not pretend this is easy. It isn't. Some days the drawer of chaos will be stronger, the walls will tremble. You'll let things in you regret later. That's part of it. But the more you return to awareness, the more you reclaim control, not over everything, but over yourself, over how you think, what you believe, where you focus. And over time, that becomes your power. Because the strongest minds aren't the ones that know everything. They're the ones that know what to ignore, what to let go of, what to guard fiercely. That's the strength that lasts. That's the kind of stronghold that helps you grow, not just survive. So when the world gets loud, when the inner noise builds, when it all feels too much, pause, breathe. Remember that not everything deserves entry. Not every thought belongs in your sanctuary. You get to choose, every moment, every day, brick by brick. How do you let go without disconnecting? Is it possible to care deeply without being emotionally enslaved? These aren't just passing thoughts. They're the quiet questions that echo in moments of heartbreak, disappointment, or overwhelming responsibility. When you give your all to something, a relationship, a cause, a dream, and it slips out of your control, it's hard not to wonder, how do I keep my heart open without letting it break me? Because somewhere along the line, we were taught that to care means to carry. That if you love someone, you must absorb their pain. If you're committed to something, you must attach yourself to the outcome. But that kind of emotional fusion becomes a trap. It blurs the line between compassion and control, between empathy and self-destruction. And what starts as genuine concern becomes a prison made of invisible bars, guilt, anxiety, obsession. Caring is not the problem. Caring is beautiful. It's human. The problem begins when caring becomes clinging. When you start to believe that your worth depends on fixing, saving, proving, pleasing, and you lose yourself trying to hold everything together. You say yes when you want to say no. You try to control what others feel, so you won't have to feel uncomfortable yourself. You stay longer than you should, give more than you have, all in the name of love or loyalty. But what if letting go isn't abandonment? What if it's clarity? Plato said, "The first and best victory is to conquer yourself." And part of that conquest is understanding where your love ends and someone else's responsibility begins. Not to become cold or detached, but to preserve your sanity. Because the truth is, you can't carry someone else's growth. You can't force someone to heal. to change, to meet you halfway. You can only offer, and then step back. That stepping back feels unnatural at first, especially when your heart is fully in it. But there's a difference between standing beside someone and losing yourself, trying to stand for them. One is connection, the other is emotional fusion. And fusion, while often romanticized, quietly erases your boundaries. Carl Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming your own whole person, was essential to mental health. That means standing apart from others, not above them. It means owning your emotions, your path, your needs, without trying to live through someone else's journey, without turning their pain into your identity. But that kind of detachment gets misunderstood. People think letting go means not caring, that it's cold or distant. In reality, it's the opposite. It takes enormous strength to love without control, to stay present without being consumed, to witness someone's struggle without rushing to rescue. It takes maturity to know that supporting someone doesn't mean sacrificing yourself. There's a quiet wisdom in restraint, in watching someone fall, even when every cell in your body wants to catch them. Not because you enjoy their pain, but because you respect their path. You know that some lessons can only be learned through experience, and trying to prevent that process isn't kindness, it's interference. It's taking away the very struggle that might shape their strength. Aristotle once said, "To love is to will the good of the other, not your version of the good, not what feels safest or most convenient for you, but their good, even if it means letting them go, even if it means releasing your grip on the version of them you once held on to." Letting go doesn't mean you stop loving. It means you start loving in a healthier way, with open hands instead of clenched fists, with presence instead of pressure. It means acknowledging that you can care without controlling, that you can stay connected without being tangled. But that takes practice, especially if you're used to overfunctioning. If you've been conditioned to fix, to appease, to prove your value through emotional labor. If you grew up believing that love is earned through sacrifice, then boundaries feel selfish. Saying "this isn't mine to carry" feels wrong. You may even confuse guilt for love. But love doesn't demand your depletion, and guilt isn't a compass, it's a wound. Socrates believed that an unexamined life is not worth living. And when it comes to emotional entanglement, reflection is key. Ask yourself, is this compassion or control? Am I helping, or am I trying to protect myself from discomfort? Do I actually trust this person's journey, or am I just afraid to let go of the version of them I need them to be? These questions aren't easy, but they reveal where you're holding on too tightly. And behind every tight grip is usually fear. Fear of abandonment, of not being needed, of becoming irrelevant. But you are not your role in someone else's story. You are not only as valuable as the comfort you provide. When you start to unravel that, you begin to see the difference between healthy care and emotional enslavement. You stop trying to rescue people from their process. You realize that your peace matters too. That you can't show up with love if you're constantly showing up without boundaries. And boundaries, contrary to popular belief, aren't walls. They're doors with locks. They say, "I'm here, I care, but I won't abandon myself to prove it." They protect your energy, your clarity, your identity. And when your boundaries are intact, your love becomes cleaner, calmer. It's no longer tangled up in fear or guilt or expectation. It's just love, offered freely, released gently. Carl Jung once wrote, "Nothing has a stronger influence psychologically on their environment, and especially on their children, than the unlived life of the parent." And that applies to all relationships. When you give up your needs, your truth, your individuality for someone else's comfort, you don't serve them. You burden them with your absence, with the quiet resentment that builds when you silence your own voice for too long. To let go without disconnecting is to stand in your full selfhood while still being open. It's to say, I love you, but I won't lose me. It's knowing that connection doesn't require enmeshment, that true presence isn't about merging, it's about witnessing, fully, respectfully, without trying to rewrite someone's narrative with your own pen. That takes emotional strength and patience and trust, not just in others, but in yourself. Trust that you can survive disappointment, that you can face uncomfortable feelings without trying to fix them, that your self-worth doesn't rise and fall with how needed you are. When you begin to trust that, you stop trying to micromanage every emotional experience. And when the urge to fix arises, as it will, you pause, you breathe, you remind yourself that loving someone also means trusting their inner resources, their ability to navigate pain, to make mistakes, to grow, even if it's slower than you'd like, even if it looks different than you imagined. Letting go becomes an act of faith, not of abandonment, a declaration that you believe in more than your own fear, that you believe in the natural intelligence of life, in timing, in consequences that teach, in love that doesn't smother. You learn to hold space, not take over, to say, I'm here, without saying, let me fix it. You learn to feel without being ruled by the feeling, to grieve without collapsing, to walk away without closing your heart. And when you love like that, something beautiful happens. You start to receive love in return that's based on mutual respect, not mutual dependency. You start to find relationships where you're not performing, proving, or pretending, just being, fully, honestly. That kind of love doesn't chain you, it frees you. It allows both people to breathe, to evolve, to make mistakes without the constant fear of emotional collapse. It creates space for honesty, because neither person is walking on eggshells, afraid that the other will shatter. So, yes, it is possible to care deeply without being emotionally enslaved, but only when you love from a grounded place. When you stop using care as currency for approval, when you stop confusing closeness with control. And you'll know you're getting there, not because you feel nothing, but because your feelings don't own you. Because you can watch someone struggle without spiraling, because you can offer love without demand, because you can finally say, I matter too, and believe it. The goal isn't detachment, it's discernment, the kind that comes from knowing who you are, what you value, and where you end, and someone else begins. That's how you let go, without letting go of yourself. That's how you love, without losing your peace. And that's how you walk through life, open, grounded, and free. Before judgment, there's perception, and before perception, awareness. That's the path every thought walks before it turns into belief. But most of the time, we skip past awareness entirely. We jump straight into conclusions, assuming we've seen clearly when, really, we've only reacted. It's not that we're wrong on purpose. It's that we're rarely still long enough to see clearly at all. The world moves fast, so does the mind, and in that rush, we form impressions, quick, automatic, and often invisible to us. We mistake these impressions for truth. But what if what we see isn't the world itself, but a filtered version of it, filtered through fear, desire, memory, expectation? Plato described it well in his allegory of the cave. We sit facing shadows on a wall, mistaking them for reality. What we call truth may only be the projection of our own internal habits. So we judge, not from clarity, but from conditioning. We judge people based on the roles we assign them. We judge ourselves through the lens of past failures or unmet ideals. But judgment isn't the enemy. It's what happens before judgment that matters. Because once you've seen something through a distorted lens, Every thought that follows will bend with it. That's why awareness is so important. It's the only way to interrupt the chain before perception hardens into opinion. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." That includes the way you see the world. If you've spent years being told you're not enough, your perception will twist everything to confirm it. If you've lived in fear, you'll read danger into every silence. You'll look at life through old pain and call it realism. But is it really truth, or just familiarity? Awareness doesn't come from forcing clarity. It comes from presence, from the quiet effort of noticing without reacting, of watching a thought rise and letting it pass instead of clinging to it or pushing it away. This sounds simple, but it's hard. The mind likes movement. It wants answers, not questions. It wants certainty, not ambiguity. But real awareness lives in that space before the mind rushes to explain. Socrates believed that the only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing. That's not self-doubt. It's humility, a kind of openness that allows you to question your own perspective, to see that what you're experiencing might not be the whole picture. It might not even be half. And in that pause, you make room for something powerful. Curiosity. Curiosity is awareness in motion. It doesn't assume, it explores. It asks, what else could this mean? Instead of declaring, this is what it means. And that shift, though subtle, changes everything. Instead of reacting from habit, you begin responding from insight. You start noticing the gap between what's happening and what you're telling yourself about what's happening. And in that gap, freedom begins. Because perception is a mirror. And mirrors don't always show us what's there. They show us what we're ready to see. If your mind is filled with judgment, you'll find flaws everywhere. If your heart is heavy with comparison, you'll see others' success as your failure. If you're stuck in resentment, even kindness can look suspicious. But change your inner world, and the outer world begins to shift. This is why awareness must come before perception. Because perception is shaped by the state of your being. Aristotle said, "It is the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it." That's the essence of awareness, being able to hold space for different possibilities without rushing to identify with any of them. Let the thought exist and let it pass if it doesn't serve truth. But how often do we pause to ask if our perception is accurate? Most of us live on autopilot. We hear a tone of voice and decide someone's angry. We see a glance and assume we're being judged. We remember an old wound and interpret the present through it. The brain is efficient. It loves shortcuts. But awareness isn't about speed. It's about depth. It's about noticing the shortcut and the long road beside it, and choosing which one serves us better. Sometimes awareness reveals things we'd rather avoid, that we're projecting, that we're clinging, that we're making assumptions based on fear rather than fact. But facing those truths isn't failure, it's growth. Awareness is not about being right all the time. It's about being honest with what's really there, even when it's uncomfortable. This honesty can be gentle. It doesn't need to be harsh. It simply says, this is what I'm feeling. This is the story I'm telling myself. But is it the only story? From there, you can question without shame. You can shift without force. You can change your perspective not because you were wrong, but because you're now seeing more clearly. And this doesn't just apply to how we view others. It applies to how we view ourselves. How much of your self-judgment comes from old labels? From the stories people told you about your worth, your abilities, your limits? Most of us are still carrying definitions from childhood, from a single moment of failure, from someone else's projection. These stories become the lens through which we see ourselves, and through that, the world. Carl Jung said, The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But that can't happen until you see yourself clearly, and that clarity requires unlearning just as much as it requires learning. It means stepping back from the roles you've been playing and asking, is this me, or is this who I thought I had to be? The more aware you become, the more you start to notice the space between stimulus and response. That pause becomes sacred. It's where you choose what kind of person you want to be, not out of impulse, but intention. It's where you stop letting fear make your decisions, where you begin to act from a place of wisdom instead of reaction. You stop judging so quickly, not because you stop seeing differences, but because you see more than just the surface. You recognize that everyone has a backstory, that most behavior is a reflection of someone's internal battle. That anger often hides pain. That arrogance often hides fear. That distance often hides the need to protect something soft and tender. Awareness creates compassion, not the kind that makes excuses, but the kind that seeks to understand. It doesn't excuse harm, but it sees context. And from that understanding, your judgments soften, not because you abandon discernment, but because you use it wisely. You stop throwing labels around like weapons. You start listening, not just to others, but to yourself. Listening becomes a form of awareness. Listening without preparing your rebuttal. Listening without jumping to fix. Listening to what's underneath the words. Most people aren't asking for answers. They're asking to be seen. But you can't see them if your mind is full of assumptions. And you can't hear yourself if you're always trying to correct what you feel. Perception sharpens when you become still, not empty, but alert. When you drop into the moment without reaching for something to control. When you stop narrating your experience and start witnessing it, even just for a breath, even just for a beat. And in that stillness, you begin to experience reality not as you fear or wish it to be, but as it actually is. That is where peace begins. Because most suffering doesn't come from what is, it comes from what we tell ourselves about what is. The anxiety that builds not from the moment itself, but from our imagined future. The shame that clings not to the event, but to the story we've attached to it. When awareness peels away the extra layers, what's left is rarely as terrifying as we feared. Even in grief, even in failure, even in pain. When you meet those things with pure awareness, you find something steady, a ground beneath the storm, a clarity that doesn't need to numb or escape. It simply sees, and in seeing, it allows healing to begin. So maybe the real question isn't, can you stop judging? But can you see clearly before you judge? Can you pause before you react? Can you be aware of the lens you're looking through? That's the practice. Not perfection, not enlightenment, just noticing. And that noticing, done daily, gently, patiently, begins to change everything. You stop being a prisoner to your first impressions. You stop living in the projections of your past. You begin to move through the world with more understanding, more choice, more peace. Because perception is not fixed. It's shaped, it's taught, it's flexible. And with awareness, you can reshape it to reflect not just what you fear or wish to be true, but what is actually true. And from there, you can finally respond to life with something rare. Presence. What really happens in that split second between stimulus and response, and how can mastering it change your entire life? It's barely noticeable. That pause, that flicker of space between something happening to you and your decision about what to do with it. A look, a message, a word said the wrong way, an unexpected bill, a sudden noise, a rush of emotion. Your heart skips. Your mind jumps, the body reacts, and before you even think about it, something moves in you. You speak, or you shut down, you lash out, or you retreat. Most of the time, It's so fast you don't even realize it was a choice. But it was. That tiny space, that breath between what hits you and what you do next, is where your power lives. Not the kind of power that demands attention, but the kind that changes everything silently. Viktor Frankl, psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, said it simply. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. He had every reason to know what he was talking about. Yet most of us don't live in that space. We live in reaction, and not because we're weak or careless, but because we've been trained to move fast. Life rewards speed. Respond quickly, answer now, decide fast, keep moving, don't stop. And in that rush, we forget the value of the pause. We forget we have a choice. But what if that pause, the one we so often ignore, is where your entire life direction can shift? What if it's not the big decisions, but those tiny micro moments that determine who you become? You get criticized. Do you defend yourself immediately, or breathe, observe, and respond with clarity? Someone you care about disappoints you. Do you react from hurt, or pause and speak from honesty, not accusation? You feel afraid. Do you run, or do you sit with it and ask what it's trying to teach you? Plato said, "The first and best victory is to conquer yourself." That victory happens not in grand gestures, but in those unseen moments. The split second where your inner world meets the outer one, and you decide who you're going to be. That space is where your habits form. It's where you either replay the same old patterns or begin rewriting new ones. And the more often you bring awareness into that space, the more power you have, not over others, but over yourself. Not to control every outcome, but to guide your reaction in a way that aligns with your deeper values. But awareness doesn't come easily, especially when your nervous system is wired to protect you. In moments of stress, your body floods with chemicals, cortisol, adrenaline, your heart races. Your mind sharpens its focus. It's trying to help, but it's focused on survival, not wisdom. It pushes you toward instinct, not reflection. And unless you've trained that space between stimulus and response, you'll keep falling into the same grooves. This is why that moment matters so much. It's where you decide not just what to do, but who to be. Are you the person who yells because they're afraid? Or the person who listens even when it's hard? Are you the one who shuts down because vulnerability feels dangerous? Or the one who learns to speak anyway? Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And that's what happens when we skip the pause. We become puppets of our unconscious reactions, playing out scripts we didn't choose. We think we're making decisions, but we're just following emotional muscle memory. To change this, you don't need to become a monk. You don't need to meditate for hours every day. You need to practice noticing. That's it. Just notice. When someone says something that triggers you, pause. When you feel the urge to judge, to lash out, to run, pause. Even just for a second, even just one breath. That breath is a lifeline. It pulls you out of automatic mode and gives you a moment of reflection. And reflection creates room for choice. Socrates believed that the unexamined life is not worth living. But examination doesn't have to mean overthinking. It means slowing down enough to see yourself in motion, to see what you're about to say, to notice your emotions rising, to step into that space and say, "Wait, is this who I want to be right now?" And maybe the answer is yes. Maybe you choose to speak up. Maybe you choose to walk away. But the difference is, it's a choice, not a reflex. That's the work. Training the space between what hits you and how you hit back. Turning that space into your sanctuary. And the more you train it, the more it grows. Like a muscle, you start to see it in new places. You start recognizing when you're about to follow an old pattern. You catch the thought before it becomes a story. You catch the anger before it becomes a reaction. You catch the fear before it becomes avoidance. And each time, you choose better. This doesn't mean you become perfect. It means you become present. And presence is everything. Because when you're present, you're not owned by your impulses. You're not driven by the need to be right or the fear of being wrong. You're simply here, awake, alive in the moment. And from that place, your actions gain depth. Your words gain meaning. Aristotle said, "Knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom." But knowing yourself means more than knowing your preferences or personality type. It means knowing your triggers, knowing your defense mechanisms, knowing the lies your mind tells you when it's scared, and still choosing to act from truth. That's what happens in the space between stimulus and response. You meet your truth, not the polished version, the real one, the one that knows why you flinch when someone criticizes you, why you shut down when you feel unheard, why you sabotage things when they get too good. Awareness makes these things visible, and visibility gives you power. So when you practice this pause, you're not just avoiding mistakes. You're rewriting your story, one moment at a time. You're choosing growth over comfort, integrity over impulse, wisdom over reaction. And sometimes you'll still react. Sometimes the space will feel too small. That's okay. The point isn't perfection, it's practice. The more you return to the pause, the more your life begins to change. Not because everything outside is different, but because you are. You become less reactive, more intentional, less chaotic, more centered. You start to trust yourself, not because you always know what to do, but because you know how to find the space before doing it. That trust builds over time. It shows up in your relationships, in your work, in how you handle failure. You stop spiraling over every mistake. You stop drowning in every conflict. You start choosing from calm, not chaos. That's the power of the space. And it's always available. No matter where you are, no matter how loud life gets, it's there, waiting, in your breath, in your awareness, in the quiet moment where you remember that you're not a slave to your emotions, you're their guide. So the next time something hits you hard, pause, even if it's just a second. Even if all you do is breathe, that second can change the whole story. That second is your power. And the more you use it, the more your life will reflect not your reactions, but your intention. Who are you when there's no one to impress, nothing to prove, and only your actions to define you? It's a confronting question. Most people spend their whole lives without ever really stopping to ask it. And even when they do, the answers aren't always comfortable. Because so much of who we think we are is built on mirrors, reflections of what others see, what they praise, what they reject. We learn to adjust ourselves to fit expectations, often before we're even aware we're doing it. The approval of others becomes the oxygen we breathe, the measure we live by. But what happens when the audience is gone? When there's no applause, no performance, and no stage? Who shows up? Strip away the compliments, the job title, the achievements, the curated persona. What's left? Because at some point, you're going to be alone with yourself. Not lonely, but alone. No one to watch, no one to validate. Just you, your thoughts, your choices, the habits you've formed and the values you actually live by. Not the ones you post about or recite in conversation, but the ones that show up when things get hard. That's where the real self lives. In the quiet, in the patterns, in the invisible decisions you make when no one's watching. Carl Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not who you're supposed to be, not who you're expected to be, who you are, And that journey doesn't begin with adding more layers. It starts with peeling them back, removing the need to perform, letting go of the need to be liked, releasing the idea that your worth is tied to what you produce, how you look, or how well you fit in. So much of life teaches us to chase identity externally, through status, through success, through being useful to others. But identity isn't something you find out there. It's something you uncover in here, beneath the noise, beneath the roles, beneath the stories you've been told, and the ones you've told yourself. Think about the energy we spend trying to maintain an image, the way we shape our opinions to match the room, the way we hold back our emotions to appear composed, the way we exaggerate, soften, or censor the truth depending on who's listening. It's exhausting, and sometimes we don't even realize we're doing it. It just becomes habit, survival, a way to avoid rejection. But the cost of that constant shaping is that we lose the shape of ourselves. We become strangers to our own values. We say yes when we mean no. We chase dreams that aren't ours. We become so good at performing that we forget how to be. Until one day, the applause stops, the room goes quiet, and we're left wondering, who am I, really? Socrates believed that the unexamined life is not worth living. Harsh, maybe, but what he meant was simple. Without reflection, we drift. We become products of the world rather than active participants in our own becoming. We confuse attention with meaning. We chase relevance instead of authenticity. And in doing so, we miss the point. Because at the end of the day, it's not about how many people approved of your life. It's about whether you did, whether you can sit with yourself in silence and feel peace, whether your actions match your values when no one is watching, whether your private life holds the same integrity as your public image. And this isn't about perfection. It's about honesty, about looking at your life and asking, what parts of this are truly mine? What beliefs do I live by when I'm not trying to please anyone? What do I return to when there's nothing to gain and no one to impress? Aristotle said, knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. And yet, most people don't know themselves. They know their role, their resume, their reputation. But when all that fades, and it will, what remains is character, that quiet force that shapes how you treat people who can do nothing for you, how you act when you won't be praised, how you speak when no one's there to applaud. True character isn't built in the spotlight. It's built in the shadows, in the moments when no one's keeping score, when you pick up the trash no one saw you drop, when you choose kindness over being right, when you admit your flaws without broadcasting your vulnerability for attention. There's something powerful about becoming the kind of person you'd admire, even if no one else notices, because that's where freedom lives, in the release of needing to be seen in a certain way, in the relief of not having to wear a mask, in the quiet confidence of knowing that who you are doesn't change depending on who's around. But that kind of self-ownership takes time and courage. It means disappointing people who liked the version of you that catered to them. It means saying no to things that once made you feel important. It means choosing solitude over shallow validation. And it means risking being misunderstood for the sake of being true. Yet that's the trade. You give up performance, and you gain peace. You lose the image, and you find your identity. And what you find might surprise you. Maybe you're softer than you let on. Maybe you're stronger than people think. Maybe your deepest values have nothing to do with success or status, but everything to do with connection, meaning, integrity. Carl Jung also said, I'd rather be whole than good. That hits different when you realize how often we trade wholeness for goodness, for approval, for belonging. But being good by someone else's definition often means cutting off pieces of yourself. It means staying silent when you want to speak. It means hiding your edges to fit someone else's mold. Wholeness is different. It's raw, unedited. It includes your contradictions, your darkness, your desire to be free and your need to be loved, your ambition and your vulnerability. It means embracing all of you, not just the parts that are easy to digest. And the more you own that wholeness, the less you need to prove anything. Because proof is only necessary when you're uncertain. But when you've done the inner work, when you've faced your fears, questioned your motives, examined your patterns, you don't need to shout your worth. It shows in how you move, how you love, how you live. So who are you without the audience? Maybe that's where your real life begins. When you're no longer chasing applause, but alignment. When you care less about how things look and more about how they feel. When your actions are less about impressing others and more about honoring yourself. That's the kind of presence people remember. The kind that doesn't have to be loud to be powerful. The kind that radiates from someone who's done the work, faced the mirror, and chosen to live from the inside out. And here's the thing, people will notice. Maybe not all at once, maybe not with applause. But over time, they'll feel the shift. In your words, in your calm, in your refusal to be pulled into the drama or the noise. Because you're not living for the stage anymore. You're living for what's real, what matters, what lasts. And what lasts isn't the spotlight. It's your integrity, your clarity, your ability to look back and say, I lived as myself, not a performance, not a projection, me dot. Why does wanting more often leave us with less? Could freedom come from subtracting, not adding? It's strange how the pursuit of more can quietly shrink our lives. More success, more stuff, more attention, more validation. We chase it thinking we'll feel whole. But somewhere in the middle of all that gaining, something essential begins to slip away. We lose clarity. We lose peace. We lose ourselves trying to grasp a version of happiness that always seems one step ahead. Like a mirage in the desert, more promises fulfillment and delivers fatigue. You get the promotion, but it doesn't feel like enough. You upgrade your lifestyle, but contentment still doesn't arrive. You gain more followers, more money, more options, and still that quiet unease lingers. That whisper that asks, why doesn't this feel like it should? Because more is a moving target. The moment you reach it, it shifts, it expands its boundaries, and what once thrilled you now feels expected. Normal, just another box checked off. This isn't failure, it's how the mind works. Carl Jung once said, the more compulsively one tries to complete oneself through external achievements, the more alienated one becomes from the inner self. He understood that our endless reaching often takes us further from what actually matters. Wanting more isn't the problem. The problem is thinking that more will finally silence the hunger. That once you get the next thing, whatever it is, you'll finally exhale, finally rest. Finally be enough. But that kind of peace doesn't come from adding. It comes from subtracting, not in a harsh, ascetic way, but in a clear, deliberate one. The kind of subtracting that peels away what's inessential, what's noisy, what's been covering the core of who you are. Think about it. Subtraction creates space, and in that space you find room to breathe, to think, to feel. When you remove distractions, you can hear your own voice again. When you clear the clutter, physical, emotional, mental, you stop managing chaos and start living with intention. That's where freedom begins. But we're not taught to subtract, we're taught to acquire. School, culture, media, they all tell us to accumulate skills, possessions, experiences, titles. And there's value in growth, absolutely. But growth without direction becomes a kind of self-inflicted chaos. You keep adding and adding until you no longer know what you were building in the first place. More tools, but less clarity, more input, but less wisdom. Socrates said, "He is richest who is content with the least." That's not about poverty. That's about perspective, about knowing that wealth isn't just what you have. It's how little you actually need to feel full. And when your needs are simple, your freedom expands. You're not weighed down by constant striving. You're not chasing things that leave you empty. You're not running a race that never ends. There's power in choosing less, in saying no when everyone else is saying yes, in keeping your circle small, your schedule light, your goals aligned with your values, not your insecurities. Because when your life is full of noise, even the most important things get drowned out. But when you subtract the excess, the signal becomes clearer. You start to notice what really energizes you, what truly matters, what you've been carrying that was never yours to begin with. And it's not just about things, it's about thoughts, expectations, old beliefs, that inner voice that says you're only valuable when you're achieving, that anxiety that tells you you're falling behind, that guilt that creeps in when you rest. These are the weights that keep us sprinting on the treadmill of more, and the only way off is through conscious subtraction, letting go of the story that your worth is tied to your output. Aristotle believed that nature does nothing in vain, and yet we fill our lives with so much that serves no real purpose. Meetings we don't need, notifications we don't want, goals we didn't choose, performances we didn't question. All of it adds up, and over time, it creates a kind of emotional clutter, a backlog of unprocessed pressure, a sense that you're always behind, always busy, but rarely fulfilled. Freedom doesn't mean you walk away from all responsibility. It means you stop clinging to what drains you. It means you start choosing what supports your deeper values. Sometimes that looks like less money but more meaning, less status but more presence, less doing, more being. And yes, it takes courage. Because stepping away from the chase means stepping away from what the world calls success. But if success leaves you anxious, tired, and disconnected, what exactly are you winning? Carl Jung also wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." That's what overaccumulation often is, a distraction from introspection. We keep busy so we don't have to feel. We fill our calendars so we don't have to ask deeper questions. We pile on more goals, more noise, more consumption, because silence feels too exposed. But silence is where truth waits. It's in the quiet moments, uninterrupted, unfiltered, where you remember who you are. Not who you're trying to become, not who you're pretending to be, just you. And in those moments, you realize how little you actually need to feel grounded. A few honest relationships, a few meaningful efforts, a quiet space, a healthy body, a clear mind. That's richness. That's enough. But that kind of enoughness has to be practiced. It doesn't come from a single insight. It comes from daily decisions, from asking, is this adding meaning or just weight? From choosing intention over impulse, from being okay with doing less if it means living more. And the world won't always understand that choice. It might call you lazy, unambitious, even strange. But that's fine. You're not here to impress the world. You're here to live in alignment with your soul. Plato once described the soul as being pulled in different directions, toward reason, spirit, and appetite. When appetite dominates, when the craving for more takes over, you become unbalanced. You lose touch with reason, with inner harmony, and so the task becomes not to eliminate desire, but to reorder it, to align your appetite with your values, to want less, not because you're numb, but because you're clear. Clarity is the reward of subtraction, not just knowing what you want, but knowing why you want it. Not just knowing who you are, but knowing who you no longer need to be. That's what minimalism really is. Not an aesthetic, but a mindset. a way of stripping away what clouds your vision so you can move through life with more purpose and less noise. You start to make different choices. You stop chasing every opportunity just because it's there. You say no more often, not to shut out life, but to create space for what truly belongs. You learn to sit with discomfort rather than bury it under a pile of distractions. You grow slower but deeper. You stretch less but root more firmly. And slowly, the hunger for more quiets. Not because you've given up, but because you've filled the deeper need, the need to be present, to be aligned, to be whole. Wholeness doesn't come from getting everything you want. It comes from knowing what you don't need anymore, and being at peace with letting it go. Letting go isn't loss, it's refinement. It's trusting that by removing the unnecessary, you're making room for the essential. It's choosing depth over breadth, being somewhere fully instead of everywhere halfway, doing fewer things, but doing them well, being known by a few people truly instead of being admired by many superficially. In that space, you find freedom. Not the loud, rebellious kind, but the quiet, steady kind. The kind that allows you to wake up without pressure, to breathe without guilt, to live without the constant itch for more. And ironically, in that freedom, you start to attract what actually matters. Because people can feel when you're living from clarity instead of craving. So maybe the next step isn't to add anything else to your life. Maybe it's to ask what you can remove. What's weighing you down, cluttering your mind, blocking your view? Maybe it's time to release an outdated goal, a comparison that no longer serves you, a belief that's kept you small. Maybe it's time to clear the path, not to find more, but to finally feel enough. Because sometimes having less lets you feel more. Sometimes subtracting is the most powerful addition you can make. And sometimes the freedom you're looking for isn't found in the next thing, but in the space that opens up when you stop chasing it. How do you remain unmoved, even while everything around you demands motion? In a world that rewards the fast, the loud, and the busy, stillness almost feels like rebellion. You're expected to keep going, to always be striving, always doing, always chasing something just out of reach. And if you stop, even for a moment, it feels like you're falling behind, as if your value disappears the second your output slows down. But what if real strength isn't in constant motion, but in being able to stand still when everything else is pulling you in? Stillness isn't stagnation. It's not laziness or passivity. It's presence. It's the quiet resistance to being yanked in 100 directions by things that may not even matter. It's choosing to respond instead of react. It's rootedness in the face of restlessness. And that kind of steadiness takes far more power than speed ever could. Plato believed that the soul was most harmonious when it was ruled by reason, not appetite or emotion. And in a way, motion often represents those two forces, desire and fear. You move because you want more, or you move because you're afraid of what happens if you don't. You chase attention, status, approval, or security, thinking they'll bring peace. But peace doesn't come from the chase. It comes from knowing how to stay centered while the world keeps spinning. But that's hard to do when motion is everywhere. Social media tells you everyone else is doing more, earning more, achieving more. Your phone buzzes with new updates. Notifications flash like they're urgent. Even your mind becomes a stream of endless movement, jumping from task to task, thought to thought, all fueled by a subtle fear that rest equals failure. Carl Jung said, "Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes. And to look inward, you have to stop moving, not forever. Just long enough to notice what's actually going on inside. Because awareness doesn't live in the chaos. It lives in the stillness. And without it, You'll keep moving through life, but you won't feel like you're really in it. Stillness is how you reclaim your time, your thoughts, your voice. It's where you meet yourself again after being lost in the noise. But it takes courage to pause, especially when the world interprets that pause as weakness. It takes self-trust to step out of the rush and say, I don't need to move just because everyone else is. It takes discernment to recognize the difference between meaningful movement and motion just for the sake of motion. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus wrote, "Freedom is the only worthy goal in life. It is won by disregarding things that lie beyond our control. And most of the motion we fall into comes from trying to control things we can't. Other people's opinions, the pace of progress, the unfolding of the future. But the more you try to manage those things, the more frantic you become. The more you believe you must keep moving, keep fixing, keep chasing, just to hold it all together. But when you learn to sit with the discomfort of uncertainty, without rushing to fix it, you discover a deeper kind of freedom. The freedom that comes from knowing that your peace isn't dependent on everything going your way. The freedom of not needing to prove anything in order to feel worthy. That's where stillness gets its power, from restraint, from calm, from choosing not to act when you know that action won't serve you. Aristotle taught that virtue lies in moderation, in balance, and balance requires awareness. It means knowing when to step forward and when to hold your ground, when to speak and when to listen, when to push and when to let things unfold. Motion without awareness leads to burnout, but motion guided by presence becomes rhythm, and rhythm allows space for silence. The more you cultivate stillness, the more you notice what actually matters. You start seeing how much of your energy is spent reacting to the news, to drama, to imagined futures. You begin to realize how often your movement is just a distraction from feeling, from sitting with discomfort, from asking hard questions, from being real with yourself. But discomfort isn't the enemy. It's a doorway. And stillness gives you the key. When you stop running from the feeling, you finally hear what it's trying to tell you. Maybe it's grief you haven't processed. Maybe it's a decision you've been avoiding. Maybe it's a truth you're finally ready to face. Whatever it is, it won't destroy you. What's more damaging is the constant avoidance of it. Socrates said, "The secret of change is to focus all of your energy not on fighting the old, but on building the new." But you can't build anything meaningful if you're constantly scattered, if your mind is in 10 places and your soul is in none. Stillness gathers you back into yourself. It grounds you. It allows you to choose your direction instead of being pulled by inertia. And that choice, that ability to pause and ask, "Is this where I want to go?" is where transformation begins. Without it, you'll keep repeating the same loops. You'll mistake movement for progress and wonder why nothing feels different. But with stillness, you break the pattern. You begin to act with intention, not just out of reaction, but out of alignment. Sometimes the greatest act of strength is choosing not to move. Not because you're afraid, but because you're focused. Because you know that the world will always demand more from you, and you've learned to listen to yourself instead. That's not weakness, it's wisdom. The kind of wisdom that comes from tuning out the noise long enough to remember what you stand for. Jung believed that we all have a true self, hidden beneath the personas we adopt. The roles we play, the performances we give, the identities we curate, they're all a kind of motion, constant shifting to fit the world's mold. But the true self doesn't need to move to be enough. It just needs to be seen, and that seeing happens in stillness. To remain unmoved doesn't mean you never change. It means you don't change unconsciously. It means you don't let the winds of fear or comparison decide your next step. It means you trust your own timing. You know that not every opportunity is right, that not every invitation is aligned, that sometimes growth happens quietly, beneath the surface, in silence, in waiting. And there's peace in that, the peace of not having to chase every trend, the peace of being okay with missing out, because you're not here to experience everything. You're here to experience what's yours, and if you're always in motion, you'll never know what that is. You'll be too busy chasing what's next to notice what's now. That's the irony. We think motion gives us life, but sometimes it just keeps us from it. The most alive moments often happen when we slow down. A real conversation, a deep breath, the stillness of a sunrise, the calm after a hard truth. These moments don't require you to move. They ask you to be present. Presence is the real goal, not achievement, not applause, just presence. Because when you're truly present, you don't need to force anything. You're not rushing to prove or to earn. You're just here, aware, awake. And from that place, even your movements become sacred. Even your smallest actions carry weight. So how do you remain unmoved in a world that never stops moving? By choosing stillness, not as a retreat, but as a return to clarity, to presence, to self. By remembering that you don't have to keep up, you just have to show up, fully. By knowing that your worth isn't measured by speed, but by depth. By learning to listen more than you speak, to feel more than you perform, to be more than you do. Stillness isn't a pause in your life. It is your life. The part of it that doesn't need permission, that doesn't need motion to matter, that just is, steady, rooted, free. What happens when you train your body and mind to do difficult things on purpose? What grows in discomfort that comfort can't teach? Most people live their lives chasing comfort, and it makes sense. Comfort feels good. It's soft, predictable. It doesn't ask much from you. You don't have to stretch. You don't have to risk. You can just stay where you are, warm and unchallenged. But here's the thing. Comfort never made anyone stronger. It never taught resilience. It never demanded growth. It simply maintained what already was. Discomfort, on the other hand, is a different kind of teacher. It's sharp, unforgiving. It doesn't care if you're ready. It pulls you into the unknown and holds up a mirror, not to hurt you, but to show you what's been hiding under the surface. And when you choose discomfort, when you lean into it, not because you have to, but because you want to grow, something starts to shift. You begin to meet parts of yourself that ease and convenience would never introduce you to. Aristotle said, "We are what we repeatedly do." Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. When you make the habit of doing hard things, you don't just become capable, you become confident. Not loud confidence, but quiet certainty, the kind that knows you can handle life, not because it's easy, but because you've faced difficulty before, and you chose to keep going. Doing hard things on purpose doesn't mean seeking out pain for its own sake. It means building your capacity to hold discomfort without collapsing under it. It's training your nervous system to stay calm in chaos. It's choosing to lift heavier, run farther, speak up when it's easier to stay quiet, sit with emotion instead of numbing it. These are small things, daily things, but over time, they rewire you. Carl Jung once said, "The difference between a good life and a bad life is how well you walk through fire." And fire doesn't always come in the form of crisis. Sometimes it's waking up early when you don't feel like it, showing up for a task you'd rather avoid, practicing discipline when no one's watching. Fire is anything that pushes you out of ease and into effort, and effort changes you. You start to see discomfort not as something to fear, but as a tool. You realize that every rep at the gym, every awkward conversation, every new skill that felt impossible at first, that's your edge expanding. That's your mental and emotional capacity increasing. And once you've felt that, once you've touched the strength that discomfort builds, comfort starts to feel less like peace and more like a cage. Plato believed that true learning doesn't come from being told, but from experience, from struggle, from the hard work of discovering truth for yourself. That applies here. Because what you discover when you lean into discomfort is that most of the limits you thought you had were just untested, boundaries you inherited, stories you absorbed, fears you never challenged. But discomfort has a way of stripping those stories down. It doesn't let you hide behind potential or plans. It asks for action. It asks, what are you willing to endure to become who you say you want to be? And your answer doesn't have to be dramatic. It just has to be consistent, because consistency in discomfort is how you build grit. And grit is what keeps you going long after motivation fades. We often think growth is about more knowledge, more insight, more tools. But sometimes growth is about less avoidance, less excuse, less waiting until it feels easy. When you train yourself to face what's hard, you don't just change your circumstances. You change your relationship with yourself. You learn that you're someone who follows through, someone who chooses courage over convenience. That identity becomes your foundation. Socrates said, "It is a shame for a man to grow old without seeing the beauty and strength of which his body is capable." And that strength is never built in comfort. It's built in the struggle, the soreness, the repetition, and it's not just physical. Your mind, like your body, grows under resistance. When you sit in silence despite your restlessness, when you stay focused despite distraction, when you stay kind despite irritation, that's strength. And it matters, because the world will throw hard things at you. That's inevitable. Loss, rejection, uncertainty. None of us are spared from it. But the question is, will you be ready when it comes? Not by luck, but by practice, by choosing every day to meet yourself where it's hard. To seek challenge, not because it's fun, but because it forges character. And character is what carries you when life doesn't go to plan. In a culture obsessed with ease, two-day shipping, instant results, endless entertainment, choosing to do hard things can feel almost unnatural, like you're swimming upstream. But maybe that's the point. Maybe that upstream resistance is what builds the kind of resilience that doesn't break under pressure. Maybe the moments where you want to quit, but don't, are what reveal your real strength. And yes, it will be uncomfortable. It's supposed to be. Growth is friction. It's you against your limits. You against your excuses. You against that voice in your head that says, "This is too much." But you'll come to recognize that voice, and you'll learn how to respond. Not with force, but with resolve, with patience, with a steady willingness to try again. Carl Jung spoke of individuation, the process of becoming whole by integrating the unconscious parts of yourself. Doing hard things intentionally often brings those parts to the surface. Your fear, your self-doubt, your need for approval, your impatience. But instead of running from them, discomfort gives you a chance to see them clearly, to work with them, to grow not in spite of them, but because you've faced them. It's not about being perfect, it's about becoming aware. Every time you show up in the face of difficulty, you're giving yourself data. You're learning how you react under pressure, what patterns show up, what excuses you lean on, and with that awareness, you gain the power to change. That's what discipline really is, not punishment, but self-respect. It's saying, I care enough about who I'm becoming to push through what's uncomfortable. It's setting a standard, not because someone else expects it from you, but because you expect it from yourself. And over time, that standard shapes you. It becomes your baseline. The interesting thing is, once you start doing hard things on purpose, your fear of them shrinks. You realize they were never as unbearable as you imagined, that the hardest part was often just starting, that your mind builds up the discomfort far more than the actual moment ever delivers. And that confidence, it's not built in comfort. It's built in the decision to try, even when you're uncertain. Aristotle also believed that virtue was about doing the right thing, in the right way, for the right reason. That applies here too, because choosing discomfort isn't about proving anything. It's not about punishment or ego. It's about alignment, about becoming the kind of person who doesn't flinch when life gets hard, because you've trained for it, and not just physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. Over time, you start to notice something else. The discomfort becomes familiar. Not easy, but known. It stops being something you dread and starts becoming something you expect, even welcome. Because now you understand. It's the doorway. And each time you walk through it, you come out more focused, more grounded, more yourself. And slowly, the things that used to scare you, the difficult conversations, the early mornings, the heavy lifts, the uncertain steps, they don't hold the same power, because you've reclaimed that power, not through control, but through courage. The courage to face discomfort and say, "This is where I grow." And what grows in discomfort? Humility, patience, grit, emotional range, integrity, the kind of character that doesn't need to announce itself. It just shows up, steady, capable, clear. And it all starts with one simple choice, to stop avoiding what's hard and start welcoming it. Because that's the paradox. When you choose discomfort, life becomes more manageable. Not because it gets easier, but because you get stronger. Your capacity grows, your tolerance expands, your peace deepens, and the challenges that once felt overwhelming become milestones that mark your progress. So what happens when you train your body and mind to do difficult things on purpose? You stop waiting for life to be easy. You stop being afraid of struggle. You stop confusing comfort with joy. And you start becoming the kind of person who can meet life as it is, messy, uncertain, beautiful, and rise again and again, not because it's easy, but because you've trained for it. Because you chose to grow where most people settle. Because you built strength where most people sought escape. Because you learned in the fire of effort who you really are. Should you listen to your emotions or interrogate them? How do we feel without being ruled? Emotions are tricky. They rush in like waves, uninvited and often unexpected. A single word, a glance, a memory, and suddenly your body tightens, your heart beats faster, and a story begins playing in your mind. Maybe it's anger, maybe it's shame, maybe it's joy or grief, or something you can't quite name. Emotions don't ask for permission, they just show up, and in the moment, they feel like truth. But here's the thing, just because an emotion feels real doesn't mean it's right. It doesn't mean it's wise. It doesn't mean it deserves to steer your actions. Carl Jung once said, "Emotion is the chief source of all becoming. There is no change from darkness to light or from inertia to movement without emotion." And he's right. Emotion moves us. It wakes us up. It drives us to act, to connect, to protect. But it can also mislead. It can distort. It can pull us into stories that are more about the past than the present. The goal isn't to ignore emotion. That leads to repression. And repression doesn't make emotions disappear. It just pushes them underground, where they fester and find darker ways to emerge. The goal is something subtler, to feel what we feel but not be ruled by it, to let emotions inform us without letting them dictate us, to make space for their message and then decide, consciously, what to do with it. That's where interrogation comes in, not the harsh, punishing kind, but the curious, grounded kind. You ask, where is this feeling coming from? Is it about this moment, or something older that's being triggered? Is it asking for action, or just for attention? Emotions, like children, often just want to be seen and heard. When you dismiss them, they scream. When you listen with compassion, they soften. They pass. Socrates believed that an unexamined life is not worth living, and that includes emotional life. To examine your emotions isn't to judge them, it's to understand them. To notice that the anger you feel toward a stranger might actually be about a boundary you haven't set in your own life. That your sadness might be grief you never gave time to. That your jealousy might be pointing to a part of yourself you've neglected. It takes self-awareness to admit that, and patience. Because emotions don't arrive in neat categories. They blur. One hides behind another. You think you're irritated, but really you're afraid. You think you're calm, but really you're numb. You think you're fine, but really you're tired in a way that sleep can't fix. Feeling without being ruled means getting honest about those layers, and that honesty takes courage. Most of us were never taught how to do this. We were told to calm down, toughen up, or just be happy. Emotions were labeled good or bad, weak or strong, and so we learned to hide, to perform, to fake it. But beneath the surface, the real feelings kept brewing, and without a healthy way to express them, they leak out, in sarcasm, in defensiveness, in avoidance, in passive aggression, in silence that says too much. Aristotle believed that virtue lies in the balance between extremes. Applied to emotion, this means not being overtaken by them, but also not cutting yourself off. It's walking the middle path, not reacting impulsively, but not pretending you feel nothing. You acknowledge the emotion, you hold it gently, and then you ask, what is the wise response here? What serves the moment, the relationship, the truth? This doesn't always lead to comfort. Sometimes it leads to hard conversations, to tears, to vulnerability. But there's strength in that, real strength, the kind that allows you to feel fully without losing your sense of self, the kind that can sit in sadness without needing to escape, that can acknowledge fear without being paralyzed by it, that can feel anger without letting it poison everything it touches. It's easy to confuse emotional intelligence with emotional control, but intelligence isn't about suppressing what you feel. It's about naming it, understanding it, choosing how to channel it. There's a difference between reacting and responding. One is automatic, the other is intentional. One happens to you, the other flows through you. Plato once wrote that the human soul is like a chariot pulled by two horses, one noble, representing reason, and one wild, representing passion. The charioteer, your conscious self, has to learn how to guide both, not by killing the wild horse, but by learning how to steer it. Emotion has energy. It can destroy, or it can transform. It can wound, or it can wake something deeper in you. The outcome depends on whether you're driving or being dragged. And this is where daily awareness matters. Noticing your patterns, asking, what emotion shows up when I feel threatened, when I feel ignored, when I fail? Do I lash out? Do I shut down? Do I seek validation? Or do I take space, breathe, reflect, and choose? It's in these micro moments that emotional maturity grows, not in the grand, dramatic breakdowns, but in the small choices. The pause before you reply, the breath before you yell, the walk you take instead of sending the text you'll regret. Those are the moments where you practice feeling without being ruled, where you train your nervous system to recognize that a feeling is not a command, it's a signal, And that signal is always trying to tell you something. But signals need interpretation. Just like pain in the body points to something beneath the surface, emotional pain does too. It's a message, not a threat. And the better you get at interpreting it, the less afraid you become of it. You stop avoiding discomfort because you know you can handle it. You've trained for it. You've sat with it before and survived. Carl Jung believed that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, by making the darkness conscious. Emotional work is exactly that. Making the darkness conscious, letting the unspoken speak, letting the denied be seen, not to wallow, but to integrate, to become whole. Because if you don't make space for your emotions, they'll find space anyway, in your relationships, in your body, in your habits. Emotional suppression isn't silence, it's delayed expression, and it often shows up when you least expect it. So better to face it now, gently, daily, before it has to explode just to get your attention. None of this is easy, but it becomes easier with practice. You start to trust yourself more, to believe that you can feel sadness without falling apart, that you can feel anger without burning bridges, that you can feel love without losing your independence, that you can be human, flawed, complex, emotional, and still be grounded. Feeling without being ruled means building that inner ground, a place inside you that stays steady even as emotions rise and fall, a core of self-awareness that isn't shaken by every mood, every trigger, every wave of feeling. That inner ground doesn't silence emotion, it holds it. It says, I see you, I hear you. Let's figure out what this means. And sometimes what it means is that you need rest, or boundaries, or connection, or truth. The emotion is the signal, the wisdom is in the pause, the power is in the response. Socrates said, know thyself. That begins with knowing what you feel, not just what you show the world, but what lives inside. And once you know, once you really know, you don't have to be ruled by it. You can feel and still choose. You can ache and still act with love. You can tremble and still walk forward. That's the balance. That's the work. Not to stop feeling, but to start relating to your feelings with clarity, with compassion, with courage. To stop asking, is this emotion good or bad? And instead ask, what is it telling me? And how do I want to respond? You'll still get it wrong sometimes. You'll still be reactive. You'll still say things you regret. That's okay. That's human. What matters is returning to awareness, returning to curiosity, returning to the part of you that knows how to feel and choose, the part that listens without being led, that feels deeply without drowning. Because the goal isn't to escape emotion. The goal is to become someone who can hold it all and remain whole. Not a trait, not a belief, but a habit. How do you build a character so solid it doesn't fracture under pressure? Most people think of character as something fixed, something you're either born with or taught early on and carry forever. But character doesn't just appear. It doesn't arrive one day, polished and complete, like a medal pinned to your chest. It's not a single choice, and it's definitely not a feeling. It's something built, quietly, repeatedly, day after day, in the moments when no one's watching, when no one's clapping, when nothing in you feels like doing the hard thing, but you do it anyway. Carl Jung once said, you are what you do, not what you say you'll do. And that's the foundation of character. Not ideas, not declarations, but action. Repeated, consistent action. Especially under pressure, when it's inconvenient, when it costs you something. That's when your habits speak loudest. And that's when your character is tested. Not when life is easy, but when it's demanding. You don't rise to the occasion. You fall to the level of your training. That phrase floats around in the world of athletes and soldiers, but it applies just as much to everyday life. The conversations you avoid, the temptations you face, the choices you make when no one's around. These are your training grounds, and the more intentional you are in those moments, the stronger your character becomes. Character isn't about appearing strong, it's about being dependable when things fall apart, when plans unravel, when someone disappoints you, when everything in you wants to lash out or give up. That's the fracture point. That's the moment when the world asks, what are you really made of? And what you're made of, what holds you together, isn't a dramatic speech or a bold opinion. It's the small, disciplined habits that have shaped your mind over time. It's how you've taught yourself to pause before speaking, to listen when it would be easier to defend, to do the right thing when it doesn't benefit you immediately, to tell the truth even when a lie would be more convenient. Aristotle believed that we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. The same is true of integrity, of courage, of honesty. These aren't traits you simply possess. They're skills you practice. And practice isn't always glamorous. It's repetitive, it's often unnoticed, and it demands patience. But with each repetition, you're laying a brick, and over time, that becomes the structure you stand on when life shakes. Building character means showing up the same way, whether people are watching or not. It means doing the difficult thing even when there's no reward. It means following through when excuses would be easier. That's how trust is built, not just with others, but with yourself. Because confidence doesn't come from compliments, it comes from evidence, and the strongest evidence is, I've done this before, I've stayed solid before, I know who I am when it's hard. And that identity, that internal trust, is priceless. Because when pressure comes, it doesn't just test your words, it tests your habits, the way you've trained your mind to respond, the way you've disciplined your impulses. And if your only preparation has been motivation, you'll crumble. But if you've practiced, if you've been deliberate, then pressure becomes a mirror, not a wrecking ball. It shows you your strength instead of exposing your weakness. Plato once wrote about the harmony of the soul, the idea that reason must guide our desires and impulses. Character is that harmony, built through choices that align your thoughts, your words, and your actions. It doesn't mean you don't feel fear or frustration. It means you don't let those feelings decide who you are. You still feel, you still struggle, but you don't let the struggle rewrite your values. That's what makes character solid. It's not rigid, it's not cold, it's responsive, not reactive. And it's that responsiveness, developed over time through self-awareness and consistent practice, that helps you hold your ground when everything else feels uncertain. Socrates believed that the greatest way to live with honor in this world is to be what we pretend to be. And we all pretend at some point. We perform, we project, we say things we haven't earned yet. But the difference between pretending and becoming is practice. Are you moving toward alignment, or are you settling for image? That question can be uncomfortable, but it's essential, because when your image and your actions don't match, something inside starts to fracture. You feel it, that quiet gap between who you want to be and how you're showing up. That's not shame, it's a signal, an invitation to realign, not through guilt, but through discipline, through the deliberate shaping of your habits. Habits are everything here, because you will not be saved by your feelings when life gets difficult. You will be saved by what you've practiced, by the small decisions you made when it didn't matter, because eventually they do. Eventually, the habit of showing up on time, of keeping your word, of choosing the hard right over the easy wrong, those choices matter. They're the threads that hold your integrity together when the storm comes. And the storm will come. That's not a question of if, but when. Someone will disappoint you. Life will take a turn. You'll feel tired or angry or uncertain, and that's when you'll see whether your character was decoration or foundation, whether it was a performance or a practice. Carl Jung believed that wholeness comes from integrating all parts of the self, not just the parts we like. Character is forged in that integration, in acknowledging your flaws, your limits, your blind spots, and choosing discipline anyway, choosing kindness even when you're bitter, choosing patience even when you're in pain, choosing to live by your values, not your moods. This is not about perfection. No one gets this right every time, but every time you choose what aligns over what's easy, you strengthen the structure, you add to the internal framework, and even if you falter, you now have something solid to return to, a rhythm, a standard, a self that doesn't disappear under pressure. And the world feels the difference. You become someone others can trust, not because you say the right things, but because you live them. You become a calming presence, not because you never feel chaos, but because you've trained yourself to stay steady within it. You become someone who lifts others, not because you perform strength, but because you've practiced it. This is how character becomes habit. Not through force, but through repetition, through integrity in the small things, through staying present, through being honest about what you're becoming. And that's the key. It's always becoming. You're never finished. You're always building, always refining, always returning to the question, who am I choosing to be right now? That's the real test. Not who you were yesterday, not who you hope to be in 10 years, but who you choose to be in the next 5 minutes. That's where character lives, in the tiny, unglamorous decisions that build your future identity, in the way you speak when you're annoyed, in the way you show up when you're tired, in the choices no one will ever know about, but you do. So how do you build a character so solid it doesn't fracture under pressure? You build it in silence. You build it in routine. You build it in honesty. You build it by living the values you claim again and again until they become the rhythm of your life. And when the pressure comes, and it will, you won't have to scramble to find your strength. You'll already be standing on it. Can suffering be reframed as fuel? What if struggle is not something to avoid, but something to use? We spend most of our lives trying to escape pain. We label it as bad, something to resist, something that means we've gone off course. Struggle is seen as a sign that something is wrong. But what if that idea isn't entirely true? What if suffering isn't a detour, but part of the path itself? Because suffering will come, whether we plan for it or not. Pain is stitched into the human experience. We lose things. We fail. We fall short. People leave. Plans collapse. Expectations go unmet. And in those moments, the first instinct is to pull away, to retreat, to shield ourselves from the burn. But sometimes it's that very burn that wakes us up. Sometimes it's the ache that clears the fog and shows us what really matters. Carl Jung once said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." And he meant it quite literally. Until something shakes us deeply, we don't usually look inward. We stay on the surface, coasting, assuming we're fine. It's only when we're forced to feel deeply that we start to ask better questions. The kind of questions that don't have easy answers. The kind that lead us into ourselves. Suffering, as painful as it is, also strips away illusion. When you're in pain, you stop pretending. You stop performing. You see who your real friends are. You see what values hold up under pressure. You find out which parts of you were built for show and which parts were built to last. Pain reveals, not gently, but honestly. And there's something powerful about that. When you stop running from your suffering and start listening to it, it shifts. It stops being something you're trying to numb or escape and starts becoming a teacher, a force that shapes you, not passively, but actively. If you let it, struggle doesn't just change your life, it reshapes your character. Plato believed that pain and pleasure were intimately connected, that they often chase each other back to back. And that's true. Some of the deepest peace comes after the hardest storms. Some of the strongest relationships form after walking through pain together. Some of the clearest insight only comes after sitting in silence with your suffering, letting it speak. But this doesn't mean glorifying pain for pain's sake. This isn't about seeking suffering. Life will hand you enough of it without you needing to go looking. The shift isn't in chasing discomfort, it's in choosing how to use it once it arrives. It's about deciding, even in the middle of something hard, this can still be useful. This can still shape something good. When you look at people you admire, the ones with real depth, real wisdom, real calm, you'll usually find that they've walked through something difficult, loss, illness, failure, betrayal, and they didn't just survive it, they used it. They let it refine them, their perspective, their empathy, their strength. It came from pain that was processed, not avoided. Aristotle wrote that we cannot learn without pain. It's a hard truth, but also a freeing one, because it means your suffering doesn't have to be wasted. It can become something more, fuel, direction, even meaning, not overnight, not easily, but eventually. It starts by not pushing it away. When something hurts, the instinct is to distract, to scroll, to vent, to find something, anything that keeps us from sitting with what's real. But if you can resist that impulse, even for a moment, and instead turn toward the discomfort, you'll find information in it. You'll start to hear the message under the emotion. What are you grieving? What are you afraid of? What part of you is being asked to grow? Socrates believed that the unexamined life is not worth living, and suffering, when faced with honesty, forces examination. It turns your gaze inward, not to punish, but to reveal. You realize what you've been avoiding, what you've outgrown, what you've believed that no longer fits. The pain forces you to confront things you might have postponed indefinitely if life had stayed smooth. That confrontation isn't easy. It rarely feels good in the moment. But it's sacred, because it holds the potential for transformation. You start to move differently, not because someone gave you advice, but because you felt your way through something and it taught you, not in your head, but in your body, your breath, your bones. This is where suffering becomes fuel, when it drives you not just to survive, but to change, to evolve, to stop playing small, to stop tolerating what drains you, to start creating a life that can hold your full self, not just the polished parts. Sometimes the pain gives you urgency. Other times, it gives you perspective. Either way, it shifts you, not by force, but by friction. You become more grounded, more humble, more present. You stop sweating things that don't matter. You stop needing as much approval. You start seeing through appearances. You grow tired of anything fake. And you begin to value what's real. Real love, real effort, real growth, real connection. Because when you've suffered, you stop needing life to be perfect and start needing it to be true. You learn how to sit in hard moments without rushing to escape. You learn how to support others in pain without needing to fix them. You learn that strength doesn't mean smiling through it all. Sometimes strength is crying and still choosing to show up the next day. Carl Jung also said, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." That choice, that moment of deciding to use the pain rather than shrink from it, is everything. It turns suffering into fire. Fire that doesn't burn you up, but burns away what no longer serves you. And that fire, once internalized, becomes part of you. It changes how you carry yourself, You speak with more depth. You move with more purpose. You stop wasting time on what doesn't align. Because when you've suffered and learned and risen, you know how fragile life is. You don't want to waste it. You also become more compassionate, less judgmental, because you understand how invisible pain can be. You know what it's like to smile while hurting, to show up while breaking inside. So you give people more grace. You listen better. You connect deeper. You offer presence instead of platitudes. And presence, that real, grounded awareness, is one of the greatest things suffering can give you. When everything falls apart, you realize how little actually matters, how little you need, how valuable a quiet moment can be. The breath, the sunlight, the sound of someone's voice. You stop chasing and start noticing. That shift is freedom. Not freedom from pain, but freedom from being ruled by it, from being defined by it. You still feel it, but you're no longer scared of it. You can sit with it, learn from it, even thank it in time. Not because it was fair, but because it made you real. That kind of transformation isn't loud. It doesn't come with applause, but it's deep. It roots you. It gives you a kind of clarity that comfort never could. Because you earned it. Through nights you didn't think you'd get through. Through battles no one else saw. Through choices that stretched you to your core. So, can suffering be reframed as fuel? Yes, if you let it shape you. If you stop running and start listening. If you meet the pain with curiosity instead of resistance. It won't be easy, but it will be worth it. Because what you build through suffering, resilience, wisdom, clarity, compassion, is unshakable. It's not something anyone can give you. It's not something anyone can take away. It's something you become. What would you change if you remembered daily that time isn't promised? It's a heavy thought, isn't it? And yet, in some strange way, we carry that awareness somewhere in the back of our minds. We know, logically, that life ends, that time runs out, that there will be a final morning, a final conversation, a final everything. But we rarely live like that's true. We push it aside. We tell ourselves we'll do it later. We treat time like a refillable glass. Always more where that came from. Until one day there isn't. And that's not meant to be morbid. It's meant to be clarifying. Because if you let that reality really settle in, not as a threat but as a guide, everything changes. The urgency you feel isn't panic. It's presence. The kind that pulls you into the moment and asks, is this how you want to spend what you cannot get back? Socrates said, beware the barrenness of a busy life. We fill our calendars, checklists, inboxes, thinking that productivity equals meaning. But if you stop to ask yourself today, am I spending my time on what matters? How would you answer? Would you be proud of how you spent your last 24 hours if you knew they were your last? That's the tension. Most of us live as if we'll live forever, but we won't. And deep down, we know it. Which means every hour wasted in mindless distraction, every moment lost to resentment, every opportunity passed because of fear. That's time we won't get back. Carl Jung believed that life is a short pause between two great mysteries. And if that's true, then what we do in that pause matters deeply. Not in the pressure-filled, achievement-driven way we're often taught, but in the quiet, intentional, soul-level sense. Not what you do to impress, but what you do to connect, to grow, to feel, to be here. Time isn't just slipping by, it's shaping you. Every day, you are becoming someone. And if you aren't choosing who that is, the world will choose for you. Your habits, your environment, your fears, they'll decide. And before you know it, years pass, and you wonder how you ended up so far from yourself. But what if, instead of pushing death to the background, you let it sharpen your focus? Not in fear, but in truth. What if you let the reality of time's limits make your choices more intentional? What would you stop tolerating? What would you say that you've been holding back? Who would you call? What would you stop waiting for permission to do? Plato wrote that time is the moving image of eternity. There's something profound in that. Time, in its fleeting nature, is the closest thing we have to the eternal, because it's always slipping through our fingers, yet always available to shape. Every second holds within it the power to pivot, to return, to begin again. But we forget. That's the real problem. We forget how fragile and short and precious this all is, not because we're careless, but because we're human. We get caught in the rhythm of routine, the autopilot hum of normal days, and in that hum, we miss things. We put off the apology, the adventure, the truth. We act like later is guaranteed. It's not. And that's not meant to scare you. It's meant to wake you up. Because when you remember that time isn't promised, you start noticing differently. The way the sunlight moves across your room in the morning, the sound of someone laughing beside you, the chance to say, "I love you," without waiting for a perfect moment. The way your heart beats right now, steady, alive, full of potential. Aristotle believed that the aim of life was not pleasure, but purpose. And purpose isn't found in grand moments. It's built in small ones, in how you show up today, in the things you choose not to delay, in the people you choose to love while they're still here to receive it. And that's one of the hardest parts, people. We forget that they too are running out of time, that the words left unsaid may never be heard, that the grudge held may become a wall that never gets taken down, that tomorrow isn't guaranteed, for them or for you. So what are you waiting for? That's not rhetorical. What exactly are you waiting for? More clarity, more certainty, someone else's approval, a sign that now is the right time. The truth is, the right time might never feel perfect, but this time, this day is real, and it's all you have. Every big dream, every bold move, every act of love or forgiveness or courage, it has to start now, not when it's easier, not when you're ready. Now, because the cost of waiting is invisible at first. You don't feel it right away. A day slips by, and then a week, then a year, then a decade, and somewhere in the middle of all that waiting, the life you meant to live passes quietly into the background. Carl Jung also said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. But what if time's limitation gives you the reason to try, to finally show up as you are, to stop performing, to stop pretending, to stop living by someone else's rules for a life they're not even living themselves? Because when time is seen as finite, you stop asking, 'What will people think?' and start asking, 'What would I regret not doing?' That shift, from fear of judgment to fear of regret, is where real change happens. It's where the life you were meant to live begins to form. And it won't always be dramatic. Sometimes it's just choosing to spend your morning differently, to turn off your phone and write, to go for a walk and actually look at the world, to hug someone longer, to speak more slowly, to listen without planning your reply. These are not big gestures, but they are the architecture of a meaningful life. Socrates said, "Death may be the greatest of all human blessings, not because it's easy, but because it brings life into sharp relief. It reminds us what matters, and more importantly, what doesn't. You start to care less about status, about proving yourself, about accumulating things that gather dust while your soul grows restless. You begin to trade image for depth, approval for alignment, the temporary for the timeless. And ironically, when you live like time is running out, life becomes richer, fuller. Not because you're rushing, but because you're here, because you're paying attention, because you're treating your time and others as sacred. You don't waste it on pretending. on holding back, on chasing things that aren't yours. You give your time to what feeds you, to who needs you, to what you want to leave behind. Not in things, but in how you loved, how you showed up, how you made people feel. So what would you change if you remembered daily that time isn't promised? Maybe you'd forgive faster. Maybe you'd risk more. Maybe you'd stop playing small in a life that's asking you to show up bigger, fuller, freer. You don't need a crisis to wake up. You just need to remember what's already true, that life is fragile, time is fleeting, and you, right now, are alive. So don't wait. Write the thing. Say the words. Be kind. Be bold. Be real. Because the clock is ticking, and that's not something to fear. It's something to use. What would you pursue if applause meant nothing to you? It's an uncomfortable question, isn't it? Because so much of what we do, even the things that feel noble or important, carries some small hope of recognition, of approval, of applause. We post, we speak, we share, we work. Not always just for the joy of it, but for the affirmation that comes after. Someone sees us. Someone nods. Someone says, "You're doing great." And suddenly the effort feels worthwhile. But what if that response disappeared? What if no one clapped? No one liked, followed, or praised? Would the work still matter to you? That's the dividing line between outer validation and inner purpose. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not who others celebrate, not who they admire, but who you are, without the performance, without the mask, without needing an audience." It's not that recognition is wrong. We all want to be seen. We all want our efforts to matter. But the problem starts when recognition becomes the goal instead of the byproduct, when applause becomes the compass instead of the echo, when we start building our lives not around what fulfills us, but around what gets the biggest reaction. And it's subtle. You might start a project because it lights you up, but then the views come in or they don't. The feedback rolls in or it doesn't, and you adjust. You chase what's loud instead of what's real. Slowly, you trade your true voice for a marketable one. Not because you're dishonest, but because attention feels good and silence feels like failure. But is it? Socrates believed that the unexamined life is not worth living. That includes asking why you do what you do. Who are you trying to impress? And more importantly, what would remain if the spotlight turned off? Because there's a kind of clarity that comes when you stop chasing applause. A stillness. You start listening inward instead of scanning outward. You begin to ask better questions. Not, will they like this? But, does this matter to me? Not, how can I look successful? But, what feels meaningful, even in private? That shift can be disorienting, because we're trained to seek feedback. We measure ourselves by reaction. If no one claps, we wonder if we missed something. But sometimes the most important paths are the quiet ones, the ones without a crowd, the ones that require solitude, faith, and the kind of strength that doesn't need to be seen to be sustained. Aristotle said, "Knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom." But knowing yourself requires stripping away everything that was added to please others. The layers, the roles, the performance. Who are you without the likes, the metrics, the reputation? What would you still wake up excited to do, even if no one ever thanked you for it? What would you study if no one ever asked for your expertise? What would you build if you knew it might take years before anyone noticed, or if they never did? These are the questions that pull you closer to your real self. They're uncomfortable because they make you confront your motives, and not all of them will be pure. That's okay. The point isn't perfection, it's honesty. To say, yes, I like being seen, but I want to do the work even when I'm not. That's where meaning lives. Because applause fades every time. Even the loudest cheers get quieter. The crowd moves on, tastes change, people forget. And if your purpose was built on being praised, what happens when the silence comes? Plato once wrote that the greatest wealth is to live content with little. That applies not just to things, but to attention, to be content with your own approval, to know deep down that your work matters because it's aligned, not because it's trending. That's real freedom. Freedom from chasing trends that exhaust you. Freedom from bending yourself to fit someone else's expectations. Freedom to say no to what's popular so you can say yes to what's personal. And that freedom grows when you build your life on values, not vanity. There's a different kind of applause. It doesn't come from a crowd. It comes from your conscience, from the quiet sense that what you're doing is true, that you're living in rhythm with yourself, that your days align with your principles, even if they don't make headlines. You'll know you're close to that when you stop needing to explain yourself, when you stop feeling the urge to justify your path to people who aren't living it, when you can sit in the silence of your own effort and feel proud, not because anyone noticed, but because you did. Carl Jung also said, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, because when you let go of applause, you face yourself. Not the image, not the brand, but the whole, raw, unfinished self. And that can be unsettling, but it's also where real confidence is built. Not from proving you're enough, but from realizing you never had to. That realization doesn't make you passive, it makes you focused. Suddenly, your energy isn't scattered trying to please everyone, it's rooted in what matters. You stop chasing 10 paths just to stay visible and start walking one path with real intention. And the irony, that's when your work starts to resonate. Not because you were aiming to be popular, but because you were speaking from truth. People are drawn to what's real, to what was built in silence, to the projects born from depth, not desperation. The applause might still come, but it's no longer the fuel, it's just background noise. So what would you pursue if applause meant nothing to you? Maybe you'd write differently. Maybe you'd love more boldly. Maybe you'd stop waiting for the perfect idea and just start building something that means something to you. Maybe you'd stop performing and start creating. Maybe you'd move slower but deeper. Say less, but with more weight. Take up less space, but in more honest ways. You don't have to abandon visibility, but you don't have to be owned by it either. You can let your work be seen without letting it be defined by how it's received. You can share without performing, build without chasing. You can create from a place that's rooted in truth, not in fear of being forgotten. Because here's what matters. When you lay your head down at the end of the day, can you say, I showed up for what matters to me? That's the applause that counts. And you don't need a stage for that. Just presence, just courage, just the willingness to do the work, even when no one's clapping. Do you need to be seen to be powerful? Or is real power invisible, immovable, untouchable? There's something seductive about being seen. In a world built around display, social platforms, status symbols, public performance, it's easy to confuse visibility with value. When people notice you, follow you, talk about you, it feels like confirmation, like proof that you're doing something right, that you matter. But attention isn't power, it's currency, and one that's fleeting, fragile, and often empty. True power doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't live in spotlight. It lives in stillness, in quiet knowing, in actions that don't ask for applause. Plato once said, "The measure of a man is what he does with power." But what kind of power was he talking about? Not just the kind that governs nations or leads armies. Not the loud kind. He meant the inner strength to govern oneself, to act with principle even when no one is watching. That's the foundation of real power. Not control over others, but command over yourself. The kind of power that doesn't show off because it doesn't need to. It's complete in itself. We're taught to chase the visible, to collect trophies, to be talked about. But when power depends on being seen, it's never secure, because you're always one step away from being ignored. One shift in opinion, one algorithm update, one scandal, and the spotlight moves on. That's the problem with building your worth on visibility. It can vanish overnight. What doesn't vanish is what you've built inside. Your discipline, your patience, your clarity. That's the power no one can take from you, because no one gave it to you in the first place. Aristotle believed that the highest good is something that exists for its own sake, not for the sake of something else. That's what inner power is. It doesn't seek attention as proof. It just is. And when you meet someone like that, someone who moves with quiet conviction, who doesn't need to prove anything, you feel it. You trust them. Not because they say the right things, but because their presence speaks louder than words ever could. Carl Jung once said, "Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." External power is about 100 watts. Internal power is about awareness. It's about knowing what drives you, what scares you, what grounds you, and then living in alignment with that. Not to impress, but to stay true. That kind of power is often invisible, because it's not about domination or performance. It's not loud or forceful. It's not built on how many people you can influence, but how deeply you've met yourself. And that self-knowledge creates a kind of immovability. Not because you're stubborn, but because you've already done the work within. You don't panic when opinions shift. You don't collapse when the room goes quiet. You remain, because you weren't performing to begin with. But it's tempting to chase the visible, especially in a world that equates presence with proof. If they're everywhere, they must be important. If people are listening, they must be right. But attention isn't always earned, and popularity doesn't equal truth. Sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones you never hear, because they're busy doing the work, not talking about it. There's a difference between being impressive and being powerful. Impressive is curated. It's designed to dazzle, to gather applause, but it often disappears once the moment fades. Power, real power, lingers. It's remembered not because it was loud, but because it was felt. Because it moved things, not by force, but by presence. Socrates believed that the soul's greatest task was to care for itself, to pursue virtue, not vanity. And virtue isn't showy, it's stable. It's earned in private, in the choices you make when no one's watching, in the standards you hold when it would be easier to compromise, in the strength to stay calm when others panic, in the ability to walk away when something isn't right, even if it costs you attention. That's power. It doesn't scream. It doesn't chase. It doesn't flinch. It just is. Rooted, steady, focused. And the people who embody that kind of power, you might not see them trending. You might not hear them speaking up every time the world expects it. But their presence carries weight. Because they're anchored. They don't move with every breeze. They don't rise and fall with applause. They build their lives not around being seen, but around being true. That kind of power doesn't need permission. It doesn't wait for validation. It doesn't need a platform to make an impact. It moves through intention, through quiet action, through alignment. It's less concerned with how things look and more concerned with whether they're right. And yet, that power can be lonely, because being unseen, while powerful, can also feel invisible. You won't always get recognition. People may misunderstand you. They might ask why you don't promote yourself more, why you don't play the game, why you don't chase the same metrics they do. And you'll have to decide, do I want to be noticed or do I want to be solid? Carl Jung also said, solitude is not the absence of energy or purpose. but the presence of focus. That's what invisible power gives you. Focus. Without the distraction of being performative, without the need to manage perception, it frees up your energy to actually do the work, to think deeply, to love fiercely, to act without fanfare. That's where true power thrives. Sometimes the most powerful things are what we can't see. Roots beneath a tree, foundations beneath a building, the hours of practice no one saw, the emotional resilience someone had to build in silence, the faith it took to keep going, even when the crowd left. These are the invisible forces that hold everything else up. You don't need to be seen to be powerful. You need to be consistent. You need to be grounded. You need to know what matters and be willing to stand by it, even if no one claps, especially if no one claps. Because applause can be addictive, and once you get hooked on it, you'll start bending. You'll chase relevance instead of truth. You'll start performing rather than living. And your power, real power, will start to fade. But if you can let go of the need to be noticed, something else emerges. Freedom. The freedom to walk your path without waiting for approval. The freedom to do meaningful work without chasing an audience. The freedom to define your value from the inside out. Plato taught that wisdom begins in wonder. And wonder doesn't need witnesses. It happens in solitude, in stillness, in the quiet realization that what's real doesn't always need to be seen to be strong. What's true doesn't need a crowd to matter. So ask yourself, what would you still do if no one ever saw you do it? What principles would you live by if there were no applause to gain? What kind of strength would you build if you never had to prove it to anyone? Those answers, those deep, private answers, are where your power lives. Not in the eyes of others, but in the steadiness of your own. And when that kind of power shows up in the world, it doesn't need to announce itself. It speaks without speaking, moves without forcing, changes things without needing credit, because it's not performing, it's just being. And that, in the end, is the most untouchable kind of power there is. What can we learn about ourselves by looking at the seasons, the stars, the tides? Are we out of sync with something older than society? There's a rhythm in the natural world that doesn't rush. The moon takes its time to cycle. The trees let their leaves fall without fear. The tide goes out knowing it will come back in. Nothing in nature forces itself to grow overnight, and yet everything grows. Everything moves, shifts, rests, returns. But we as humans have created a world that resists rhythm. We've built lives that are urgent, always moving, always demanding more, faster now. And in that constant acceleration, something ancient gets lost, not outside of us, but within. Carl Jung once wrote, "The least of things with a meaning is worth more in life than the greatest of things without it." Nature in its quiet cycles holds deep meaning. And when we pause long enough to notice, it reflects back to us truths we've forgotten. That life isn't linear, that growth isn't always visible, that stillness is not emptiness, but part of the pattern. The seasons don't bloom year-round, and neither do we. But society tells us we must. That rest is lazy, that slowness is weakness, that productivity is purpose. And so we push ourselves to keep going when we're tired. We judge our worth by what we produce. We hide our need for pause, for reflection, for softness. We forget that even the sun disappears for half the day and still returns with light. Plato believed that the soul was more than logic and reason. He saw it as something connected to the eternal, something that recognized harmony not only in thought but in the natural order. That recognition still lives in us. You feel it when you walk through a quiet forest, when you stand under a sky full of stars, when you watch a wave rise and crash without effort. In those moments, something in you remembers you are not separate from this. You are part of it. But we've drifted. Modern life has pulled us away from the old rhythms. We stay up under artificial light. We eat out of sync with the land. We measure time by deadlines, not by sunrises. We live in boxes, move in straight lines, follow calendars that don't care whether the body or soul is ready. And then we wonder why we feel disconnected. There's an intelligence in nature that doesn't need instruction. The bear doesn't debate when to hibernate. The tide doesn't resist the pull of the moon. The tree doesn't question whether shedding its leaves is weakness. It simply trusts the cycle. It surrenders to what is. Not passively, but wisely, knowing that everything has its time. Aristotle spoke of eudaimonia, often translated as human flourishing. But flourishing isn't frantic. It's not found in burnout or constant motion. It's found in alignment with yourself, with your values, with the world. And alignment can't happen if you're cut off from the deeper rhythms that shaped you long before society did. We're not meant to sprint through life. We're meant to ebb and flow, to rest, to reflect, to gather before we leap. But the world rarely gives permission for that. So we have to learn to give it to ourselves. We have to learn how to listen, not just to noise, but to stillness, to the quiet pull of our own inner tides. Those tides are subtle. They don't shout. They rise in your body as fatigue you try to ignore. They come as intuition you override, as longing you distract yourself from. But they don't go away. They return, like the moon's pull on the sea, asking you to slow down, to return to something older, simpler, more true. Socrates taught that wisdom begins in knowing how little we know. Maybe part of that wisdom is realizing how little we understand about our own nature, how often we fight against our own seasons, trying to bloom in winter, trying to race when we're called to root. But nature doesn't resist itself, and maybe neither should we. To live in rhythm doesn't mean to abandon ambition. It means to pursue it with respect for your natural pace. It means to recognize that progress includes plateaus, that growth includes decay, that clarity often comes not from effort, but from stillness. The seed grows in the dark before it ever touches the sun. The moon doesn't rush its phases. It doesn't apologize for waxing and waning. And yet, in its changing light, it still guides the ocean, still lights the night. Power doesn't always look like constancy. Sometimes it looks like presence, like showing up in each phase with honesty, without pretending to be full when you're empty. There is so much to learn from looking up, looking out, looking inward through what the world reflects. The stars remind us of scale, how vast, how ancient, how connected everything is. The tide reminds us that withdrawal is not the end. The tree reminds us that letting go is part of staying alive. Nature doesn't just surround us. It mirrors us. It invites us to remember who we were before we forgot. Carl Jung also believed that symbols and archetypes in nature, light, dark, sun, moon, earth, fire, live in the psyche. That to understand the self, we must understand the patterns that shape the world. That the unconscious mind speaks in these rhythms, in these images. Which means that when we look at the seasons, we aren't just observing. They're speaking to something ancient inside of us. But to hear that voice, we have to slow down. We have to stop filling every moment with noise, every hour with doing. We have to learn the difference between motion and meaning, between exhaustion and purpose, between a full schedule and a full life. The old world didn't forget this. They marked time by solstices, by moon cycles, by migrations and harvests. They understood that there's a time to reap and a time to rest, a time to speak and a time to be silent, a time to rise and a time to return. We've tried to outgrow these truths, but they still live in us. No matter how fast we move, the body remembers, the soul remembers. And when we ignore those rhythms, something inside begins to break down. Anxiety, burnout, restlessness that no amount of productivity can solve. Because we're not just tired, we're disconnected. We're out of sync, not just with nature, but with our own nature. And no amount of effort can replace alignment. So maybe the way forward isn't to do more, but to remember more, to return to the wisdom of the seasons, to let ourselves live in cycles instead of schedules, to know when to push and when to be pulled, to feel what time of our own life we're in, and to honor that. Because there are seasons of building and seasons of breaking, seasons of speaking and seasons of listening, seasons of becoming and seasons of just being. All of them are part of growth. None of them are a waste. Even winter, cold and bare, is necessary. It's where the roots deepen, where the next chapter quietly begins. Aristotle also said that nature does nothing uselessly, and neither do you. Even in your stillness, even in your waiting, even in the slow moments where nothing seems to be happening, life is moving. You are shifting. The work is being done, even when it can't be measured. But we must choose to see it, to trust it, to return to it. The world may not applaud you for slowing down, but nature doesn't need applause to bloom, and neither do you. So what can we learn by watching the stars, the tides, the seasons? We learn to wait, to trust, to let go. We learn that movement doesn't have to be loud, that silence isn't empty, it's full of transformation, that rest is not the opposite of progress, but a condition for it. We learn that we are not separate from this world, we are stitched from the same rhythm. And maybe the deepest wisdom is not in mastering life, but in matching its pace. Not in forcing our way forward, but in remembering the direction was always written, in the wind, in the water, in the wild, in us. Do you know your thoughts, or do you just live inside them? What could happen if you made them visible on paper? Most of us never really stop to examine what's going on in our minds. Thoughts appear, and we accept them. We follow them. We argue with them. We believe them. They become our mood, our worldview, our reality. And because we're so used to the noise in our heads, we often forget that it's even there. It just is. Like background music we stop noticing, but still dance to. But what if you paused? What if you stepped back? What if, instead of just swimming in thought, you started to look at it from the shore? One of the simplest, yet most powerful ways to do that is to write. Not to impress, not to perform, but just to see what's inside. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." That's what most of us are doing, living out stories, assumptions, fears, and beliefs we've never actually examined. And journaling, or even just writing in any raw form, is how you begin to notice the patterns, the voices, the repetitions. You take what's vague and swirling, and you put it on the page, and suddenly you're not in the thought, you're looking at it. That distance changes everything. Thoughts feel permanent when they stay in your head. They loop, they blur, they repeat themselves and pretend to be new. But when you write them down, they stop moving. They're no longer abstract. They have shape, edges. You can read them and ask, is this true? Do I actually believe this? Where did this come from? Socrates believed that the unexamined life is not worth living, and he wasn't just talking about philosophy and the abstract. He was talking about self-inquiry, the kind that doesn't happen through passive thought, but through deliberate reflection. When you write, you begin that examination. You become both the thinker and the observer. You start to see the gaps, the contradictions, the wounds you've been avoiding. But writing isn't just for the moments of clarity. It's also for the confusion, especially the confusion. Because the act of writing, just putting pen to paper without knowing where it's going, has a way of pulling the threads together. You may start out tangled, uncertain, lost in the fog, but line by line you begin to find your way through. Not by solving everything, but by naming it, making space for it, saying, "This is what I'm carrying. This is what I haven't said out loud." Aristotle said, "The soul never thinks without a picture," and writing creates that picture. It takes what's internal and invisible and gives it form. It lets you see yourself, not just how you look, but how you think, how you fear, how you hope. And often, what you find on the page surprises you. You realize you've been holding beliefs that don't reflect who you are anymore. You see emotions you never fully acknowledged. You recognize patterns you've repeated without realizing why. That's the power of writing without a filter. You're not curating. You're not performing. You're not writing to be read. You're writing to understand. And in that process, you become more honest with yourself than you've been in a long time. And here's something strange. When you start making your thoughts visible, they often lose their grip. A fear that felt enormous in your chest looks small in words. A judgment that felt like truth reveals itself as insecurity. A dream you've been ignoring starts to take shape, simply because you gave it attention. Plato believed that knowledge is remembering something the soul already knows. Writing is a form of that remembering. You're not always discovering new truths. You're rediscovering old ones, parts of yourself that got buried under busyness or shame or distraction. The page becomes a place to meet yourself again. And yet, many people resist writing. They say they're not good at it, that they don't know what to say, that it feels silly, pointless, uncomfortable. But that discomfort is the threshold. That's where the work begins. You don't write because you have answers. You write because you have questions. You write to hear what your mind sounds like when it's not being interrupted. You write to see what happens when you stop editing your feelings in real time. The page doesn't judge you. It doesn't interrupt. It doesn't need you to make sense. And that's what makes it sacred. It's one of the few places where you can be fully honest without consequence. You can say things you're not ready to say out loud. You can be angry or confused or hopeful or lost. And in that space, healing begins. Carl Jung also said, "Solitude is for me a fount of healing which makes my life worth living." Writing creates solitude, not isolation, but space, a clearing in the noise, a place where you can sit down, not with answers, but with yourself. And slowly things begin to shift. You become less reactive, more thoughtful, more aware. You stop taking your thoughts at face value. You start asking where they come from, what they want, and whether they're serving you. That kind of awareness doesn't happen by accident. It happens through practice, through showing up to the page, even when you don't feel like it, even when the words are clumsy, even when it feels like nothing's happening, because something is happening. You're training your mind to slow down, to process, to integrate. And integration is different from insight. Insight is sudden. It's the light bulb. But integration is slower. It's taking that insight and turning it into action, into awareness that shows up not just on the page, but in your relationships, in your choices, in the way you speak to yourself when things go wrong. Socrates believed that wisdom begins in wonder, and writing is an act of wonder, not knowing, but wondering, sitting with the question rather than rushing toward the answer, letting the question do its work, letting it move you. You don't have to write every day to benefit from this, but you do have to write honestly, not to sound smart or healed or deep, just to sound like you, the real you, the uncertain, searching, evolving version, the one who's tired of carrying so much unspoken thought, the one who's ready to lay it down, even just for a page, because that page is a mirror. And when you look at it long enough, you begin to see through the surface. You begin to meet the version of you who's been waiting to be heard. Writing won't solve everything, but it will reveal everything. And from that place, change becomes possible, slowly, quietly, line by line. You start to move through your days differently. You become a little more patient, a little more grounded, a little less tangled in the chaos of your own mind, because now you know what's in there. You've seen it, you've written it, you've faced it. Aristotle said, knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. But knowing yourself isn't a one-time event. It's a conversation, ongoing, evolving. And writing is how you stay in that conversation, how you stay honest, how you stay close to what matters. So do you know your thoughts, or do you just live inside them? You can find out. All it takes is a blank page and the courage to begin. What's more powerful, convincing someone or becoming someone worth emulating? We grow up learning how to argue our case, how to persuade, explain, defend. We're taught that the right words can move people, that if we just say it clearly enough, if we lay it out logically or passionately enough, we can shift someone's mind. And sometimes that works. A strong argument can open a door. A well-timed phrase can plant a seed. But words alone rarely lead to transformation, not deep, lasting transformation. Because people don't just listen with their ears. They watch, they feel, they notice what doesn't match. And this is where something deeper begins. Because it's one thing to say something meaningful. It's another thing to live it. When your life aligns with your values, when your actions reflect your beliefs without needing to be broadcast, people sense that. And that kind of presence, quiet, steady, embodied, is far more persuasive than any argument. Not because it pushes, but because it draws. It doesn't force agreement. It offers a model. Plato once wrote that the soul naturally seeks what is good, what is beautiful, what is true. But it needs to see it. Not in abstract theories or words alone, but in real life, in people, in examples, in quiet leadership that doesn't call attention to itself. When you become the kind of person whose choices reflect clarity, humility, and courage, others notice. They may not say it. They may even resist it. But part of them remembers. This is how it can be. And it's not always dramatic. It's often subtle. The way someone listens fully, without rushing to speak. The way they hold their word, even when it costs them something. The way they respond to conflict without turning cold or cruel. These are the moments that echo. They plant a quiet question in others. Could I live like that? What would my life feel like if I operated from that kind of strength? Aristotle believed that virtue wasn't a single act, but a habit, a way of being built through repetition. He called it ethos, a person's character, and he taught that ethos is the most persuasive element in any argument, not just because it earns credibility, but because it shows what's possible. It bridges the gap between theory and experience. And the truth is, most people aren't looking to be talked into something. They're looking to be shown a better way to live. They want to believe that peace is possible, that love can be consistent, that honesty doesn't have to be brutal, that confidence doesn't have to be loud. They want proof that these things work, not just in words, but in practice. And when they see it lived, something shifts. Carl Jung said, "You are what you do, not what you say you'll do." It's easy to preach values. It's harder to embody them, especially when it's inconvenient, especially when no one's watching. But that's where your influence is forged. In the quiet choices, in the hard days, in the consistency that doesn't break when it's tested. We've all met people who talked a good game, but lived another. Their words may have been smart, even inspiring, but there was a gap, a sense that something didn't add up, and that gap breaks trust. Even if we can't explain it, we feel it. That's why transformation doesn't come from persuasion alone. It comes from alignment. There's a kind of integrity that doesn't need to raise its voice. You feel it in the presence of someone who has done the inner work, who has faced themselves, who doesn't need to control others because they've learned to lead themselves. That's the kind of person people remember, not because they convinced us, but because they became someone we want to become more like. And it's not about perfection. It's about transparency, about humility, about someone who can say, "Here's what I believe, and I'm doing my best to live it." Someone who owns their mistakes, who keeps learning, who doesn't posture, because influence doesn't come from being flawless. It comes from being real and steady. Socrates once said, "Let him that would move the world first move himself." That's where it begins, with the decision to focus less on changing others and more on refining yourself, not in isolation, not to withdraw from the world, but to live in such a way that your presence invites change without demanding it. You can spend your energy trying to convince people, defending your point, debating, proving, or you can spend that same energy becoming someone whose life speaks, someone who doesn't have to prove their point, because their point is proven in how they live. That doesn't mean you never speak up, but your words carry more weight when they're backed by a life that's aligned. And when you live that way, consistently, quietly, something happens. You stop needing to win arguments. You stop needing to be right all the time. Because you've shifted from persuasion to embodiment. You've moved from saying the truth to being the truth. That's influence that can't be faked. People watch more than they listen. They're paying attention, even when you think they aren't. They notice how you treat the person who can't help you, how you handle failure, how you behave when it's inconvenient to do the right thing. These are your messages, and they speak louder than any speech ever could. Aristotle also said, "Character may almost be called the most effective means of persuasion." And he was right. Because character isn't what you claim, it's what you consistently do. It's the sum of your habits, your responses, your discipline. And when it's strong, people trust it, even if they don't fully agree with you yet. We live in a culture obsessed with visibility, with platform, with saying things loudly and often. But real influence doesn't always come with a spotlight. It comes from living in such a way that, even in the quiet, others feel it. They feel your steadiness, your clarity, your kindness, your integrity, and they start to wonder what kind of work shaped that. Carl Jung also said, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." The work of becoming someone worth emulating starts inside. It's slower, less glamorous, but it's deep, and it lasts. Because it isn't built on reaction, it's built on reflection. It doesn't shift with every opinion. It's rooted in something deeper than approval. When you shift from convincing to becoming, you also free yourself. You no longer need everyone to agree. You no longer tie your peace to someone else's understanding. You can let people grow at their own pace. Because you trust that your life is saying what it needs to say, even if no one claps for it yet. That's the kind of influence that changes families, communities, culture, quietly, steadily, through example, through presence, through the choice, over and over again, to be someone who lives what they say. And that's not always easy, but it's worth it. Because at the end of the day, your most powerful message isn't something you say, it's who you are. And when who you are matches what you value, you won't need to convince anyone. You'll simply become the reason they start asking better questions. And in time, maybe even living better answers. What if the ultimate goal isn't peace, success, or even virtue, but to become someone that life cannot break? That question turns everything upside down, because most of what we're taught to pursue, peace, comfort, success, approval, sounds like the end game. Like once we have those things, we've made it. We're safe. We've won. But life doesn't work that way. It never promised us easy days or fair outcomes. It never said, once you reach this point, nothing bad will touch you again. If anything, it seems to do the opposite. It tests, it shakes, it strips away the surface, and what's left is the real measure of who you are. Carl Jung once said, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." That's the center of it all. Life will happen to you. It will break the rules. It will hit when you're already down. It won't care about your timeline or your plans. And in those moments, the question won't be, did I achieve peace? Or was I successful? The question will be, can I still stand? To become someone that life cannot break doesn't mean becoming numb or cold or untouchable. It doesn't mean avoiding vulnerability. It means being able to walk through fire and still stay intact, still stay true, still stay human. That kind of strength isn't loud. It doesn't always look impressive. Often it's quiet. It's forged in solitude, in early mornings when you want to quit, in hard conversations that stretch your heart. It grows not in moments of ease, but in the times when you've lost something and still choose to keep moving forward. Plato believed that the soul becomes stronger through struggle, that there's a kind of inner clarity that can only come when the outer world is falling apart, because in those moments, all your masks are stripped away. You can't fake who you are when everything's burning. You either bend or you become. So maybe the real work isn't about chasing comfort. Maybe it's about building the kind of core that can hold steady no matter what. A character that doesn't collapse when things don't go as planned. A mind that doesn't betray itself under pressure. A spirit that doesn't shut down, even in the face of deep loss. And that kind of core is built, not born. It doesn't arrive because you read the right books or repeated the right affirmations. It's built through experience, through pain, through showing up again and again when it's inconvenient, uncomfortable, even unfair. It's built when you choose discipline over chaos, when you keep your word, even when it costs you, when you speak the truth, even when your voice shakes. It's built in the small hidden decisions, the ones no one sees but you. That's where strength is formed. Aristotle taught that virtue lies in the balance between excess and deficiency. Courage, for example, is not recklessness, and it's not cowardice. It's the balance in between, the strength to act in the face of fear without being consumed by it. That's what it means to be unbreakable, not to never feel fear, but to move through it with integrity. And integrity matters, because when everything around you starts to shift, the only thing you can really rely on is who you've become. Not what you have, not what people think of you, not how smooth life feels, just the self you've built. And if you've built it well, honestly, patiently, deeply, then even when life takes from you, it cannot undo you. That's the key. Life can take, it can shake the foundation, but if your identity is rooted in your values, your effort, your depth, then there is something in you that can never be taken. Socrates said, "No evil can happen to a good man, either in life or after death." What he meant wasn't that harm won't come, it will. But that true harm, harm that breaks the soul, only happens when you betray yourself, when you give up what you know is right for what is easy, safe, or praised. And life will tempt you to do that. It will say, just bend a little, just look away, just silence that voice inside you. And it might even reward you for it, in the short term. But deep down, you know when you've compromised, you know when you've stepped out of alignment. And no success, no applause, no peace of mind will last if it's built on the cost of your own soul. That's why becoming unbreakable is the goal. Because when you're whole on the inside, the world loses its power to control you. You're not easily swayed by trends or opinions. You don't collapse under pressure because you've already done the work within. You've met your shadow. You've faced your fear. You've trained your heart not to flinch every time life gets loud. And that training? It's not glamorous. It's not quick. It happens in the daily choices, the quiet mornings, the hard moments that nobody applauds. But it adds up, layer by layer, until one day something happens that would have wrecked the old you, and you remain standing. That's when you know. You've become someone who bends, but doesn't break. Someone who feels, but doesn't drown. Someone who loses, but doesn't lose themselves. Carl Jung believed that wholeness, not perfection, was the goal of life. And wholeness comes when you've accepted every part of yourself, the strong and the soft, the light and the shadow, the joy and the grief. All of it belongs, all of it is part of becoming. And when you become whole, you become steady, not because life is easier, but because you are. You don't chase peace, you create it within. You don't cling to virtue, you live it. You don't measure yourself by success, you measure yourself by truth. And in that space, you become unshakable, even in heartbreak, even in failure, even in uncertainty. Because now, the storm doesn't define you. It reveals you. And what it reveals is someone who cannot be broken, because they've already been through fire and found something deeper on the other side. Not immunity, not detachment, but depth. And that's stronger than steel. So maybe the real question isn't, how do I get what I want out of life? Maybe it's, how do I become the kind of person who stays whole, no matter what life takes? Because when you become that person, you don't just survive the chaos, you lead through it. You walk through the ashes without losing your light. And that, more than peace, more than success, more than even virtue, is the ultimate strength. No matter what life throws at you, becoming someone it cannot break, that's the real victory. Not in what you achieve, but in what you endure without losing who you are. If this spoke to something in you, there's another video waiting on the screen that might go even deeper. Thank you for being part of Stoic Journal. Now go live like the future is already yours.